The dawn came quietly over the 7 hills of Rome, a city still young but already ancient in its spirit. The streets smelled of smoke, olive oil, and ambition. Voices rose in the forum long before sunrise, merchants haggling, senators debating, soldiers gossiping about campaigns in distant lands. Above it all, Rome was learning how to rule itself, having cast out its kings and sworn an oath to the Republic. Freedom, they called it. But freedom, like power, was a fragile thing, always hungry, always uncertain, and in that restless air, around the year 100 BCE, a child was born into the patrician Julii family. His name, Gaius Julius Caesar. His lineage, they whispered, traced back to the goddess Venus herself, a divine thread woven through centuries of mortal ambition. Whether or not it was true hardly mattered. In Rome, to claim descent from the gods was not arrogance, it was destiny. His family was noble, but not rich. The Julii once stood tall among the founding families of the Republic, yet by Caesar's birth, their fortunes had dimmed. His father served as a minor governor in Asia. His mother, Aurelia, was proud, intelligent, and fiercely protective. She watched her son with the clear-eyed awareness of a woman who understood the balance between ambition and danger. In her embrace, the boy learned both affection and restraint traits that would one day become the scaffolding of his public face. Rome itself was changing. The Republic had survived wars against Carthage and Hannibal's elephants. It had conquered Greece and Spain, filled its coffers with gold, and its streets with slaves. But victory had fractured its heart. The gulf between the poor and the powerful grew like a canyon. The Senate, once a bastion of civic virtue, had become an arena for greed. Every law, every speech, every vote was a battle for advantage. In the markets, commoners whispered that Rome was sick with its own success. Bread was scarce, riots were frequent, but in the grand marble halls of the patricians, ambition pulsed like blood. Every senator dreamed of outmaneuvering the next, and every noble family raised their sons to be sharper, louder, and more daring than those before them. It was in this world turbulent and glittering that young Caesar grew. He studied in the dim morning light with Greek tutors who taught him the art of rhetoric. The boy learned to twist language like a sword, to charm and persuade with words rather than force. Yet even as he memorized verses of Homer and Cicero's speeches, his imagination lingered on Rome's founding myths, the tale of Aeneas, the Trojan hero who carried his gods through fire to start anew on Italian soil. In Aeneas, Caesar saw a reflection of his own hunger to build something that would outlast him. As he came of age, the political winds shifted. The Republic was gripped by turmoil. Rival generals Marius and Sulla tore the city apart in a storm of power and vengeance. Marius, Caesar's uncle by marriage, championed the common people. Sulla, cold and calculating, stood for the Senate's authority. Their feud drowned Rome in blood. Caesar, barely 16, watched as soldiers marched through the streets carrying torches and banners, their sandals striking the cobblestones like thunder. He saw heads displayed on the rostra, in the forum, men who had dared to choose the wrong side. Even at that age, he understood. In Rome, politics was war by other means, and yet, amid that chaos, he began to form his own sense of destiny. He was tall for his time, pale, with dark eyes that never blinked too long. Those who met him spoke of his composure, his ability to stand perfectly still, to listen without interruption, and then, with one carefully chosen phrase, to change the mood of an entire room. There was something magnetic in him, something dangerous too, though few could yet see it. When his father died suddenly, Caesar inherited both name and duty. He was still barely a man, but Rome did not wait for mourning. Politics demanded swift loyalty, and Caesar gave his to his uncle Marius, aligning himself with the faction of the people, the populares. It was a daring choice. Sulla's shadow loomed large, and those who opposed him did not live long. Caesar's first marriage was to Cornelia, daughter of Cinna, another enemy of Sulla. It was a union of politics and affection, a dangerous alliance in dangerous times. When Sulla seized control of Rome and demanded that Caesar divorce her, the young man refused. His relatives pleaded with him to obey. Sulla was ruthless. Defiance meant death. But Caesar stood firm. "Tell Sulla," he said quietly, "that I would sooner die than abandon my wife." It was a simple statement, yet it carried the weight of a revolution. Sulla, amused and irritated, spared him barely. "In this Caesar," he muttered, "there are many Mariuses." It was both a warning and a prophecy. Banished from Rome, Caesar fled across the Italian countryside. He grew lean and hardened, surviving by wit and grit. The boy who had once studied poetry now slept beneath olive trees, carrying little more than a cloak and a sword. Along the way, he was captured by pirates off the coast of Asia Minor. They demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver. Caesar laughed and told them they were insulting him, it should be 50. The pirates, amused by his audacity, agreed. During his captivity, he treated them not as captors but as subordinates. He joined their games, recited poems, and promised that once he was free, he would return and crucify them all. They thought he was joking. He was not. When the ransom was paid and he was released, Caesar immediately raised a small fleet, hunted the pirates down, and carried out his promise mercifully, ordering their throats cut before they were nailed to the cross. It was his first act of command, swift and unflinching, and it made his name known among soldiers and senators alike. He returned to Rome a different man. His youthful idealism had burned away, replaced by a quiet, disciplined confidence. He knew now what power could do, how it could shape men, and how it could destroy them. He began his climb carefully, serving as a military tribune, then as a priest of Jupiter. His speeches in the Forum drew crowds. His generosity made him beloved among the poor. But Caesar was still an outsider to the ruling elite. To them, he was too ambitious, too charming, too dangerous. They saw the same glimmer Sulla had seen, and so they tried to ignore him, hoping he would fade into one of the countless noblemen Rome devoured and forgot. He would not. In the glow of Roman torches, as twilight fell over the Tiber, Caesar often walked alone along the riverbanks, thinking of what lay ahead. The city seemed eternal, but he could sense its fragility, the fractures beneath its marble surface. He believed Rome needed more than debate and compromise. It needed direction. It needed a man unafraid to seize destiny. The winds off the river carried the smells of the city, incense, sweat, and stone. Above, the stars shimmered over the Capitoline Hill. Somewhere deep inside, Caesar felt the pulse of something immense, a hunger not for gold, nor for glory alone, but for order. He was still young, but the Republic was old, weary, and corrupt. And as Rome drifted in the fog of its own success, Caesar began to imagine what it might mean to remake it. The world had yet to hear his name spoken with awe or fear. But in that silence between the flicker of lamps and the whisper of ambition, a legend stirred awake. The house of Julii. In the heart of ancient Rome, family was everything: bloodline, legacy, reputation. It was said that the dead lived as long as their names were spoken, and in the house of the Julii, every breath, every echo of history carried that weight. The gens Julia, proud and old, claimed descent from Aeneas, the Trojan hero, who fled the burning walls of Troy to found a new destiny upon Italian soil. And through Aeneas, their lineage reached the goddess Venus herself. To be born a Julian was to be born beneath the gaze of divinity, and such ancestry was both a blessing and a burden. For young Gaius Julius Caesar, the family's grandeur was no shield from hardship. Though noble, the Julii were no longer wealthy. Their estates had dwindled over generations, their influence dimmed by political missteps. Yet in Rome's ever-turning wheel of fortune, Even faded nobility retained its spark, and Caesar, even as a boy, seemed to embody that ancient light. He grew up on the Suburra, a crowded, noisy district not far from the Forum. It was not the neighbourhood of marble villas or perfumed gardens, but of smiths, bakers, and tavern keepers. The air smelled of bread and bronze, of sweat and dust, of ambition. For a patrician family to live there was unusual, even scandalous, but Aurelia, his mother, believed in practicality over pride. She taught her son to observe, to listen, to remember the faces of the people. From his window, Caesar could see both the squalor of Rome and the grandeur of its temples. He would watch senators carried by slaves through narrow alleys while beggars pressed at their feet, pleading for copper coins. He saw how power moved through the city not in straight lines, but in whispers, alliances, debts, and glances. Rome was not a city of marble, it was a city of masks. His mother, Aurelia Cotta, was a woman of remarkable presence. She was neither meek nor silent, but poised, intelligent, and unafraid to challenge the men of her household. She managed the family's affairs with quiet efficiency, ensuring that her son grew not into softness, but into resilience. Aurelia's influence would leave a deeper mark on Caesar than that of his father, who served dutifully as a provincial governor but lacked the magnetism that Rome demanded. Each morning, before the sun fully crested the hills, Aurelia's house stirred with the rhythm of Roman life. Slaves carried water from the cisterns, polished lamps, and ground grain for bread. Caesar would wake to the murmur of Latin prayers, the scratch of a stylus on wax tablets, and the sound of his mother dictating letters to her household steward. Education was sacred. Caesar's tutors drilled him in rhetoric, Greek philosophy, history, and the precise rituals of Roman religion. He learned to recite the Iliad and Odyssey, to quote philosophers with ease, and to write with a hand that revealed clarity of thought. But more than words, he absorbed the subtleties of tone, the pauses that could change meaning, the silence that could command respect. Rome was a world of performance. To speak poorly was to die politically, and Caesar, even as a boy, practiced every phrase as though it were a sword stroke. When he was 10, he accompanied his father to the Forum for the first time. The noise was overwhelming. Sellers hawking olives, donkeys braying, orators declaiming from the rostra. Caesar stood among the crowd, watching senators pass like living statues, their faces impassive, their gestures measured. In that moment, something within him stirred, not awe, but understanding. He saw not gods in togas, but men fragile, fallible, and pretending at immortality. That realization would never leave him. By adolescence, Caesar had grown into a striking youth, pale-skinned, dark-eyed, with an expression both gentle and sharp. He was not a soldier yet, but he already carried himself with the grace of command. People remembered his voice, a rich, even tone that could soothe or sear, depending on his will. He was not the strongest, nor the most athletic, but his willpower was relentless. When others tired, he endured. When others hesitated, he spoke. And yet, his path was not without danger. The Republic was already fracturing. Power in Rome had grown monstrous, no longer balanced between Senate, magistrates, and people, but hoarded by the few. Rival factions tore at the state from within. The names Marius and Sulla began to dominate every conversation. Gaius Marius, Caesar's uncle by marriage, was a hero of the people, a general who had defeated the Germanic tribes and reformed the legions, allowing even the poor to serve. But his populist reforms made him hated by the Senate. His rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, was the embodiment of aristocratic pride, ruthless and calculating. Their feud plunged Rome into civil war. Caesar's family stood with Marius. It was a choice that would nearly destroy them. When Sulla marched on Rome, the first Roman general ever to do so, his soldiers desecrated temples, burned homes, and slaughtered citizens by the thousands. The Suburra ran with blood. Marius fled, then returned, then died. and with his death came vengeance. Sulla's victory meant purges, lists of names posted in the forum, declaring who was to live and who was to die. The name Julius Caesar nearly joined them, but fate, or perhaps fortune, intervened. Caesar's youth, his connections, and perhaps his divine lineage spared him. Still, he was stripped of his priesthood, his property, and forced to flee the city. The boy who once studied poetry and rhetoric became a fugitive. Yet even exile could not dim his fire. He wandered Italy in disguise, moving from one friend's villa to another. Bandits stalked the roads. The air smelled of pine and fear. He carried only what he could, some coins, a sword, and a stubborn will. It was during those nights beneath open skies that he learned something that no tutor could teach. How to wait, how to endure, how to listen to silence. Years later, he would tell his soldiers that patience was a weapon sharper than steel. Perhaps it was born there, on those lonely roads. After Sulla's death, Caesar returned to Rome cautiously, like a man re-entering a city haunted by ghosts. The Republic was quieter, but not healed. Senators smiled with false warmth. The poor still starved. Rome, he realized, had not been saved, it had only changed its mask. And Caesar, now grown, had changed with it. He began to court influence carefully, attending gatherings, supporting candidates, paying debts he could not afford to make, allies he could not yet use. He learned to smile while calculating, to flatter while observing. He gave speeches that ignited applause, then walked away as though indifferent to praise. He was building something invisible, a web of obligation, favour, and loyalty. In Rome, that was how power was truly won. At home, Aurelia continued to guide him. She oversaw his marriage to Cornelia, daughter of the powerful Cinna, securing their place among the populares, the faction of the people. The wedding was simple but symbolic, a union of two families, bound by shared ideals and shared risk. Rome watched, half admiring, half wary. Caesar was rising too quickly, they whispered, too confidently, but those whispers only fed him. At banquets, amid the golden glow of oil lamps, senators would study him, his quiet laughter, the way he leaned forward when he listened, the sharpness in his gaze. They sensed something they could not name, an inevitability cloaked in charm. The boy from the Suburra, with dust still on his sandals, now dined among the elite. He had learned the rules of their game, and soon he would learn how to rewrite them. For in Caesar's heart, the name of the Julii was not merely a lineage, it was a prophecy. And as the night deepened over Rome, the hum of distant voices, the flicker of lamps against marble walls, a new star was rising. One born not of privilege, but of vision. Not content to live within the myths of his ancestors, but determined to create his own. In the house of Julii, beneath painted ceilings and the scent of burning laurel, destiny stirred. The blood of gods flowed quietly in mortal veins, and the Republic, still blind to its fate, continued its endless feasting and fighting, unaware that its future had already awakened. Youth in the shadows of Sulla, Rome was not a safe place for the young and ambitious. The marble heart of the Republic pulsed with danger beneath its grandeur. The air itself carried the scent of iron and betrayal. Senators spoke of virtue in the daylight, but behind their polished words were blades, hidden and ready. The Republic had grown old and sick, richer than ever, but poisoned by the greed of its own guardians. It was into this world that Julius Caesar began his passage from youth into manhood, and his journey would be tested by the cruelty of one man above all. Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Caesar was barely 20 when the civil war erupted in blood and fire. He had grown up hearing stories of honor and order of Rome's divine mission to bring civilization to the world. Yet now he saw senators hunted like animals through the forum, heads nailed to the rostra as warnings, and the streets running red with citizens' blood. Rome had turned upon itself, and at the center of that storm stood Sulla, victorious general, self-proclaimed restorer of the Republic. and the man who would nearly end Caesar's life before it had truly begun. Sulla's rise was swift and merciless. He had fought his way to power through the corpses of his enemies, declaring himself dictator for as long as he deemed necessary. To the Senate, he was salvation. To the people, he was terror. His soldiers carried lists of the condemned names inked on tablets and hung in public squares. They called them the proscription lists. Anyone named could be killed on sight. Their property was seized. Their families were ruined. The young Julius watched all this unfold with quiet fury. He had inherited his mother Aurelia's discipline and his uncle Marius's defiance, and it was that lineage that made him dangerous in Sulla's eyes. For Caesar was not only Marius's nephew by marriage, he had also bound himself to the populares, the faction of the people, by marrying Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, one of Sulla's greatest enemies. When Sulla demanded that Caesar divorce her, the command was simple but absolute. Disobedience meant death. But the young man refused. Those who knew him expected hesitation. Instead, he answered with calm conviction, his voice quiet but steady. "I will not abandon my wife," he said. It was not a shout. It was a statement measured, unwavering, and dangerous. Even Sulla's allies were startled by the audacity. They pleaded for clemency on Caesar's behalf, reminding the dictator that this was just a youth, proud, perhaps foolish, but harmless. Sulla's reply was ominous. "You do not know what you are protecting," he muttered. "In this Caesar, there are many Mariuses." And so, Caesar became a fugitive. His priesthood revoked, his property confiscated, he slipped out of the city under the cover of darkness. The roads beyond Rome were perilous, infested with bandits, deserters, and Sulla's patrols, but he pressed on. At night, the young noble slept under trees, listening to the sound of the wind moving through cypress groves and the far-off cry of wolves. He carried little more than a cloak, a handful of coins, and his resolve. He was hunted, poor, and ill, yet he refused to break. He had learned young that survival in Rome demanded patience. He had also learned that fear was a tool, a weapon to be wielded, not obeyed. Even in exile, Caesar was taking notes on power, who used it, who abused it, and how easily it could be taken back. Eventually, illness struck him down. Fever burned through him, and he was forced to rest in a remote village, cared for by strangers. His recovery was slow, and it left him changed. Those who saw him afterward said his eyes were sharper, his movements quieter. The fever had not weakened him, it had stripped him of youth's illusions. He no longer believed in the justice of Rome's old order. He believed only in strength, not brutality, but the strength to outlast every enemy, every tide. When word finally came that Sulla had died, Caesar returned cautiously to Rome. The dictator had left the republic scarred. The Senate was diminished, its dignity tarnished by obedience to tyranny. Many of those who once condemned Sulla now praised his reforms. Caesar watched this hypocrisy with cold clarity. The republic, he realized, was not ruled by laws. It was ruled by fear, by gold, and by the will of whoever dared to seize it. He began to rebuild his life, but he was no longer a boy seeking favor. He was a man testing the edges of his influence. He returned to his studies, sharpened his oratory, and began to move quietly through the city's networks of power. He attended trials, not to watch, but to learn the tone of persuasion, the rhythm of deception, the subtleties of how crowds turned. Rome was a stage, and Caesar was learning how to command it. He sought out teachers among the best Greek scholars, Roman orators, philosophers who taught that logic and beauty could coexist with ambition. In their words, Caesar discovered his weapon. He practiced speaking until his voice could hold a crowd in silence. He learned to argue without raising his tone, to charm without smiling, and to make his opponents believe that his victories were their own. But politics alone would not elevate him. In Rome, military glory was the true key to greatness. Caesar knew that the men who ruled the Republic, Marius, Sulla, Pompey, had carved their legacies not in ink, but in blood. And so, in his mid-20s, he sought a post abroad as a soldier. The East called to him, the provinces of Asia and Cilicia, lands of ancient wealth and Greek refinement. There, he could begin anew, free from the watchful eyes of Rome's rivals. His voyage across the Aegean would become the stuff of legend. Somewhere between the coast of Asia Minor and the island of Pharmacusa, pirates captured his ship. They demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver. Caesar, with the calm arrogance that would one day define him, laughed in their faces. 20? He said. You insult me. I am worth at least 50. The pirates, amused by his composure, raised the ransom as he suggested, and for nearly 40 days Caesar lived among them. Most men would have trembled or begged for freedom. He did neither. Instead, he acted as though he were their commander, ordering them to be silent when he slept, joking with them, and even composing poems to recite aloud. He told them half in jest, half in prophecy, that once he was free, he would return and crucify them all. They laughed. But when the ransom was paid and he was released, Caesar gathered a small fleet, hunted down the pirates, and captured them. True to his word, he crucified them, but in an act of strange mercy, he ordered their throats cut first, sparing them agony. It was the first time he had exercised absolute power, and it suited him. The young noble, once the hunted, had become the hunter. His justice was swift, his memory long. Those who followed him in later years would remember this story and understand that Caesar's kindness was never weakness. It was a prelude to judgment. When he returned to Rome, his reputation had changed. No longer merely a promising orator or a defiant aristocrat, he was now a man of action. The tale of the pirates spread through taverns and temples alike. Senators sneered at his vanity, but secretly they admired his audacity. He began to climb the cursus honorum, the traditional ladder of political offices: military tribune, quaestor, aedile, praetor, consul. Each step required not only skill but money, and Caesar had little. So he borrowed, lavishly, from wealthy allies, most notably Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Debt became his weapon. Others feared it. Caesar used it to bind powerful men to him. Money, he once said, is like soldiers, it must be made to serve. As quaestor, he travelled to Hispania, where he managed finances and learned administration. It was there that he first saw a statue of Alexander the Great, the Macedonian, who had conquered the known world before the age of 30. Caesar stood before it for a long time, silent. When a companion asked what troubled him, Caesar replied softly, "Do you not see? Alexander was my age when he had conquered the earth, and I have done nothing worth remembering." It was not despair in his voice, but awakening. Ambition, once a flicker, had become flame. In Spain, he began to command troops, and his natural talent for leadership became evident. Soldiers followed him not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. He shared their rations, walked beside them through mud, and called them by name. They adored him for it. To his men, he was not just a commander. He was a comrade who understood both hardship and glory. By the time he returned to Rome, Caesar's confidence was complete. He had learned to balance humility and dominance, generosity and calculation. He threw public games, dazzling the crowds with chariot races and gladiators' spectacles he could barely afford. He gave speeches that stirred the poor and frightened the Senate. Every debt, every favour, every gesture was part of his design. But beneath the charm and laughter, something darker was forming. Caesar had seen the rot at the heart of the Republic, the corruption, the incompetence, the endless squabbling of men too small for their own power. And though he would never admit it aloud, a thought had taken root. Rome needed more than politics. It needed a ruler. That conviction, once seeded, would never leave him. The years of exile, danger, and defiance had forged him into something new. He had faced death, loss, and humiliation, and had come to see them as tools. From Sulla, he had learned the cost of fear. From the pirates, the use of boldness. From Spain, the taste of command. By the time he returned to the city for good, he no longer walked among Rome's marble pillars as one of its citizens. He walked as though he already owned them, and in a sense, he did. The forum hummed with gossip of this ambitious young man. The Senate eyed him warily, sensing in him both danger and destiny. The people, weary of hunger and corruption, began to cheer his name. Above all, Caesar himself sensed that his hour was approaching. Rome was ready for change, and he intended to be the one to bring it. He had walked through the shadows of Sulla and survived. He had seen the cost of tyranny and the price of weakness. And somewhere deep inside him, beneath the calm voice and elegant manners, burned the knowledge that one day all of Rome would either follow him or fall before him, return and rebirth. The Roman Republic had changed since the days when Sulla's men marched through its streets. The marble still gleamed in the sunlight, and the Senate still met beneath its vaulted ceilings. But something had shifted in the city's soul. The old order, those proud, noble families who claimed to guard Rome's virtues, had grown weary and suspicious. Money, not honor, held the keys to power now. Debts bought loyalty, gold decided justice. When Julius Caesar returned to Rome, he was no longer the fugitive youth who had defied Sulla's decrees. He was older, leaner, and sharpened like a blade forged in exile. The fever that once nearly killed him had burned away what softness remained. He had seen the cruelty of tyranny and the fragility of freedom, and he had learned that both could be mastered by one thing alone: will. The first thing he did was study the new Rome with the same patience he had once used to observe his tutors and generals. He saw the endless feasts of the rich, the overcrowded slums of the poor, the senators arguing about philosophy while the streets overflowed with beggars. Rome was still powerful, but it was cracked, hollowed from within. To rise in such a place, Caesar knew, required something more than wealth or name. It required spectacle. It required the careful crafting of image. He began with appearances always immaculate, never excessive. His hair was carefully arranged, his toga pressed and gleaming, his manner poised between charm and command. He moved through the forum, not as a man seeking favor, but as one who already deserved it. And soon, people began to notice. He spoke at trials and assemblies, each word measured, each pause deliberate. The first time he addressed the crowd after returning, they were restless and skeptical. Yet when he finished, they stood in stunned silence before erupting into cheers. His voice, calm and melodic, carried through the marble halls with such control that it seemed almost magical. Even his enemies began to listen. Caesar's first official position upon returning was as a military tribune, a relatively modest role, but he made it matter. He used every opportunity to display decisiveness, mercy, and courage. His reports were clean, his accounts honest, his soldiers loyal. He did not command through fear, but through admiration, and when men followed him into battle, they did so with the unshakable trust that he would share both danger and reward. In the years that followed, he was elected quaestor, serving in Hispania under a provincial governor. It was a small post by Roman standards, administrative, bureaucratic, but Caesar treated it as if it were an empire. He studied every law, inspected every tax record, and observed the lives of the local people with uncharacteristic empathy. He spoke their dialects, attended their festivals, and judged disputes personally. It was there, in Spain, that he encountered the statue of Alexander the Great. He stopped before it for a long time, silent, as the afternoon sun cast golden shadows across the marble. His aides thought he was admiring it, but his expression was not pride, it was sorrow. When one finally asked what troubled him, Caesar replied quietly, "Do you not see? Alexander was my age when he had conquered the world, and I have done nothing." Those who heard it never forgot. It was the moment when his ambition became something greater than hunger, It became destiny. That night, beneath the foreign stars, he walked alone outside his quarters, listening to the hum of distant cicadas and the rustle of olive trees. The air smelled of dust and salt, and in that stillness he made a silent vow that he would not rest, not truly live, until Rome itself was his to shape. When his term in Hispania ended, Caesar returned to Rome transformed. He was welcomed not as a bureaucrat, but as a man of vision. His name began to circulate in the city's gossip, spoken with curiosity, admiration, and fear. He understood then that politics was not about truth, but about story. Rome adored stories of heroism, generosity, divine favor, and Caesar began to weave himself into one. He sponsored lavish games and gladiatorial combats at his own expense. The crowds adored him, cheering his name until it echoed through the forum. His generosity seemed boundless bread for the hungry, coin for the soldiers, feasts for the poor. And though these spectacles drove him into deeper debt, Caesar did not care. "Debt," he once said to a friend, "is the price of glory." The Senate, watching from their marble seats, sneered. To them, he was reckless, too close to the mob, too willing to please the commoners. They whispered that his debts would ruin him, that his ambition would consume him, yet privately, they feared him. For all their wealth, none could command the hearts of the people as Caesar could. His charisma was not the shallow charm of an orator, it was something deeper, magnetic, almost divine. He looked at each man as though he understood him, as though he saw through pretense to the heart beneath. He could disarm rivals with kindness and destroy them with silence. By his early 30s, Caesar's rise seemed unstoppable. He was appointed aedile, a magistrate responsible for public games and buildings. This was the perfect stage for a man of spectacle. He spared no expense, organizing festivals that dazzled the city. Chariot races thundered across the Circus Maximus. Exotic beasts were brought from Africa. Gladiators fought beneath the blazing sun while the people roared his name. But these were not mere entertainments, they were performances of power. Every coin he spent was a seed of loyalty. Every cheer was an investment in his legend. Rome began to see him not just as another nobleman, but as something greater, a man of the people who could stand among gods. At night, when the torches burned low and the crowds dispersed, Caesar would often stand alone on the balcony of his home, overlooking the sleeping city. The air was heavy with the scent of rain and stone. He could hear the faint hum of the Tiber below, the distant cries of vendors closing their stalls, and he would whisper to himself words that no one else could hear. "Rome is not eternal, but I will be." Despite his growing popularity, his enemies were watching. Among them was the conservative senator Cato, a man of austere virtue who despised Caesar's extravagance and ambition. Cato saw in him the same dangerous spark that had burned in Sulla and Marius, a man who believed himself larger than the Republic. Cato's warnings went unheeded. For every senator who distrusted Caesar, 1,000 citizens adored him. His debts were enormous, but so was his influence. And now, a new opportunity beckoned. Egypt. The death of King Ptolemy had left the Nile kingdom in chaos, and Rome's governors in the east were anxious. Caesar saw beyond the politics, he saw a stage on which to demonstrate Rome's strength and his own. His journeys there would later intertwine with the destiny of a queen whose beauty and cunning would alter the course of history. But before Cleopatra's shadow entered his life, there was still the matter of Rome's own turmoil. The Republic was growing restless again. Factions split the Senate. Corruption spread like rot. The poor filled the streets, demanding food and land. The generals, each commanding legions loyal only to themselves, began to dream of power beyond the Senate's decrees. Caesar watched them carefully. Pompey the Great, proud and powerful. Crassus, rich and calculating. They were rivals, yet both admired him, and he, ever the strategist, saw in them the pieces of a greater plan. In the dim light of Rome's winter evenings, as senators argued and slaves lit the lamps along the Via Sacra, Caesar began to imagine something new, not a republic fractured by ambition, but a state united under one vision, his own. For now, he would play the role of loyal servant. He would flatter the Senate, charm his rivals, and continue to entertain the people. But beneath the calm surface, he was already plotting the architecture of power, how it could be taken, held, and shaped. There were nights when he stood in the forum long after the crowds had gone, the moonlight turning the columns silver. The wind carried faint echoes of orators past, and he would close his eyes, picturing the Rome that could be. Not the Rome of endless quarrels and petty greed, but a Rome of destiny, a Rome led by one mind, one hand, one vision. He was not ready to act. Not yet. But the pieces were moving, and Caesar, patient and deliberate, was already several steps ahead of every man around him. When dawn broke, painting the sky in crimson and gold, the city awoke once more to its routine markets, debates, and gossip. No one could have guessed that beneath those ordinary mornings, a revolution was quietly forming in the heart of one man. The boy who had defied Sulla's wrath was gone. In his place stood a figure of unshakable purpose, a man who would not be content to serve the Republic, but would bend it to his will. Julius Caesar had returned to Rome, not as a survivor, but as its inevitable future. The road through Spain, the road to power in Rome, did not travel in straight lines. It wound through distant provinces, through battles and debts, through whispers and applause. For Julius Caesar, that road led westward to the mountains and sunlit plains of Hispania, the land Rome called Spain. It was here, far from the marble temples of the capital, that he would learn what it truly meant to lead men, to conquer, and to command destiny itself. By the time Caesar was sent to Spain as quaestor, he was still young, yet his name already stirred attention. Rome's debts weighed heavily on his shoulders, but his charm and confidence disguised his precarious situation. He arrived in Hispania with little more than a few servants, a reputation for brilliance, and an ambition that glowed like iron in a forge. The province was vast and wild, mountains crowned with snow, valleys thick with olive groves, and distant towns where Latin mixed with local dialects. Rome's grip on these lands was firm but restless. Rebellion always smouldered just beneath the surface. The Roman governor welcomed Caesar cautiously, aware that this young patrician had a reputation for being both charismatic and dangerous. Caesar, ever the observer, studied everything. He watched how Roman officials treated the locals, how the soldiers carried themselves, how taxes were collected and justice dispensed. He quickly saw that the system was rotten, corruption fed greed, and cruelty bred resentment. He also saw opportunity. He began his duties quietly at first, managing accounts and disputes. But unlike most administrators, he did not isolate himself behind marble walls. He rode through villages, met with elders, and listened to grievances. He paid attention to the farmers, the merchants, the soldiers who guarded Rome's borders. Slowly, the people began to speak of him with respect. He was not like the others, they said. He did not take bribes, nor did he treat them with disdain. He was stern, but fair. When a corrupt magistrate overtaxed a town, Caesar intervened personally, ordering restitution. His superiors frowned upon such interference, but Caesar did not care. Justice, he once said, is not a matter of convenience. It is a matter of courage. It was during one of his journeys through Hispania that Caesar encountered the statue of Alexander the Great. It stood in a temple courtyard, its marble face serene and eternal. The conqueror's gaze seemed fixed on something far beyond the horizon, as though even death had not ended his ambition. Caesar stopped and stared. His attendants waited, silent, as the wind moved through the columns. After a long pause, he spoke softly. Alexander died at 32, he said, after conquering the world, and I am his age, yet have done nothing. There was no jealousy in his voice, only realization. In that moment, Caesar's ambition crystallized into destiny. He would not be another Roman magistrate lost to history. He would be the man who outshone Alexander, who brought Rome not merely wealth or glory, but eternity. His time in Hispania proved to be his transformation. He rode with his legions through rugged terrain, leading from the front rather than commanding from afar. He shared his soldiers' food, slept on the ground beside them, and marched in the same dust. When they faltered, he reminded them, not with threats, but with example. A leader, he told them, must never demand what he would not endure. They loved him for it. To his men, Caesar was not a distant patrician, but one of them fearless, sharp-eyed, and tireless. He could outthink any rival and outwalk any soldier. He knew the value of courage, but he also understood the importance of spectacle. When victory came, he made sure it was seen, felt, and remembered. It was in Spain that he fought his first real campaign. A local tribe, defiant and proud, rose against Roman rule. The rebellion was small by the standards of the great wars Rome had known, but to Caesar it was a stage, a test. He studied the terrain, the enemy's tactics, and struck with surgical precision. When the battle ended, he stood on the field, his armor streaked with dust and blood, watching the last light fade behind the hills. Around him, his soldiers cheered. It was a small victory, but to him, it felt like a prophecy fulfilled. For his bravery and leadership, Caesar was awarded the civic crown, a wreath of oak leaves, given to any man who had saved the life of a Roman citizen in battle. It was one of Rome's highest honors. He wore it with quiet pride, knowing that the crown was more than decoration, it was a symbol. A reminder to Rome that this young man, who had once defied Sulla, now bore the Republic's highest emblem of valor. As governor's assistant, Caesar also displayed a remarkable gift for administration. He organized roads, enforced discipline, and reformed tax collection to favor efficiency over exploitation. Under his watch, the province began to flourish. Merchants thrived, local tribes cooperated, and even his enemies admitted his success. But success in the provinces meant nothing without recognition in Rome. Caesar knew this. Every act of justice, every battle won, every word spoken to his men, he documented them meticulously, ensuring that when he returned, his deeds would speak for him. When his term ended, Caesar prepared to return home. His debts still haunted him, but he had gained something far greater legitimacy. He was no longer the reckless youth who courted scandal. He was now a soldier, a statesman, and a rising star in the eyes of Rome. Yet, as he crossed the mountains back toward Italy, he knew that Rome itself was changing faster than ever. The city he would soon re-enter was not the same republic of his youth. Factions tore at each other in the Senate. The rich grew richer, the poor cried louder. The optimates, the conservative elites, clung desperately to tradition, while the populares, the reformers, demanded justice and redistribution. Rome's unity was an illusion, and Caesar could see its fractures clearer than anyone. He realized something essential, that the Republic was not failing because of its people, but because of its structure. It could no longer contain the ambitions of men like Pompey, Crassus, or himself. It was a city too vast, too complex, too fragile to be ruled by 100 competing voices. It needed one voice, one vision. That thought, once dangerous, now seemed inevitable. On his way home, Caesar was detained briefly in southern Gaul by creditors demanding repayment of his enormous debts. His financial ruin was so severe that he risked arrest before even setting foot in Rome. Yet fortune, or perhaps charm, intervened again. His wealthy friend Crassus, the richest man in the Republic, agreed to cover much of his debt, buying Caesar's loyalty and securing his political partnership. It was a fateful alliance. Crassus, with his immense wealth, and Caesar, with his unmatched influence over the people, began to form an unspoken pact. Each man needed the other. Caesar required money to sustain his ambitions, and Crassus needed Caesar's charisma to extend his reach into the hearts of the masses. By the time he reached the gates of Rome, Caesar was ready to begin the next stage of his ascent. His military triumphs in Hispania had proven his skill, his debts had been soothed by Crassus's gold, and his reputation among the poor had grown into near adoration. He had turned every misfortune, exile, illness, debt, into a tool. At his return procession, the people filled the streets to see him. Torches flickered in the evening air, and garlands hung from the balconies. Children shouted his name. Women threw flowers into the dust before his horse. He rode not as a conqueror of nations, but as a symbol of what the Republic still longed for, a man who could rise from nothing and make Rome great again. But behind the smiles and cheers, the senators watched him closely. They had seen men like him before Marius, Sulla, men who rose too high and too fast. They whispered that Caesar was dangerous, that his ambition had no limits, that he was the kind of man who would burn the Republic just to warm his hands. Perhaps they were right, but in that moment, beneath the twilight sky, Caesar looked upon the city of his birth and felt not guilt or restraint, but calm inevitability. He had tested himself in exile, proven himself in battle, and mastered the hearts of men. Now, he would test himself against Rome itself. He understood, better than any of his peers, that power in the Republic was not seized by force alone. It was built brick by brick, favour by favour, heart by heart, until it could no longer be denied. The road through Spain had taught him many things: endurance, leadership, patience. But above all, it had taught him that the world belonged not to those who waited for permission, but to those who claimed it. And so, as the torches burned and the cheers echoed through the night, Caesar rode forward with that serene composure that would define his life, the calm of a man who already saw his destiny written in the stars, waiting for him to reach up and take it. The Republic still thought it was safe, still believed itself unshakable. But in the heart of the man riding through its streets, something vast and unstoppable had already begun. The conqueror was returning home, the master of the masses. Rome had always loved a show. Even in its darkest hours, the city thrived on spectacle. The thunder of chariots at the Circus Maximus, the cries of gladiators in the sand, the roaring laughter of the mob that decided with a thumb who lived and who died. But no man in Rome's long and bloody history understood the soul of the crowd better than Julius Caesar. When he returned from Hispania, he came back not only as a decorated officer, but as a man reborn, polished, cunning, and prepared to mould public will like clay in his hands. The Senate saw in him another ambitious noble, young and indebted, but they underestimated how deeply he understood their own decay. Caesar knew the truth of the Republic, that the people hungered not for speeches or policies, but for hope, hope wrapped in glory, in laughter, in bread and blood. He began by mastering the art of visibility. Every move was deliberate. His toga gleamed whiter than any other's. His sandals were perfectly strapped, his scent faint but memorable, a whisper of luxury that hinted at power rather than flaunted it. He walked with the slow, steady pace of command, his eyes always meeting those of the people who watched him. It was said that when Caesar looked at you, it felt as if you alone existed in the world. He began to rebuild his alliances carefully. He befriended Crassus, who provided the gold that kept his debts at bay, and flattered Pompey, the greatest general of the age. With these two pillars of influence, money and military fame, Caesar wove the beginning of an empire yet unborn. But first, he needed the people. To the masses of Rome, the farmers, the shopkeepers, the veterans who begged for land, he became a voice of compassion. He spent lavishly on games and festivals, staging events that dazzled the city. Exotic beasts from Africa, mock naval battles, parades of musicians, feasts for the hungry, all paid for with borrowed money. But the people didn't care how it was funded. They cared only that Caesar gave them what the Senate would not: attention. His peers scoffed. He bankrupts himself to please the mob, they sneered. But Caesar knew better. He wasn't buying applause, he was buying loyalty. Every cheer, every coin tossed into the crowd was an investment in faith. He once said, half smiling, "If I must be loved or feared, I prefer both, but love lasts longer." As aedile, he oversaw Rome's architecture and celebrations. He restored public buildings neglected by lazy senators, planted gardens, and lined the streets with torches so the people could walk safely at night. He even repaired the ancient Forum temples, quietly adding his own name in carved letters beside those of forgotten ancestors. It was a subtle gesture, one that said, "I am not merely reviving Rome's past, I am becoming it." The commoners adored him. They crowded around his house, shouting his name at dawn, praying for his protection. His face began to appear in painted murals and street carvings, rare honours for a man who was not yet consul or general. Caesar had turned himself into something larger than life, a man of destiny who seemed to bridge the gap between God and citizen. But not everyone was enthralled. The Senate watched his rise with growing unease. To them, he was a dangerous populist, a man too eager to please, too comfortable among the poor. They murmured that he courted tyranny with his generosity, that his games were less charity than propaganda. Among his fiercest critics was Cato the Younger, a man of incorruptible virtue and unbending pride. Cato despised Caesar's theatrics, his debts, his charm. "He smiles too easily," Cato once said. "Beware the man who never shows his teeth except to hide them." Cato stood for the old republic, the belief that Rome's greatness came from restraint, discipline, and law. Caesar represented something far older and far more dangerous: charisma, will, and destiny. Their rivalry became the quiet heartbeat of Rome's politics. Cato thundered in the Senate about preserving tradition. Caesar stood in the Forum, promising a new dawn for the people. Cato had followers of principle. Caesar had followers of passion. And passion, Caesar knew, wins. The turning point came with his election as Pontifex Maximus, the High Priest of Rome, an office that controlled not only religion, but also immense political influence. It was supposed to go to an older, wealthier man, but Caesar campaigned with relentless brilliance. He visited temples, courted priests, and charmed the crowds. On the day of the election, the city was alive with tension. His mother, Aurelia, wept as he left their house that morning. "You will win," she whispered, "or never come home again." She was right. When the votes were counted, Caesar had triumphed, not through bribery alone, but through magnetism. He now controlled Rome's sacred rituals, the calendar, and the divine legitimacy that underpinned every act of state. He was not yet king, but he held a priesthood older than the monarchy itself. The Senate grumbled, but the people rejoiced. To them, Caesar's rise was a sign of divine favour, that perhaps the gods themselves smiled upon him. He began to preside over ceremonies with solemn grace, draped in white, speaking prayers that echoed across the marble courtyards. Yet behind the piety was calculation. Every ritual was a stage, every gesture a message. He understood that religion was not about faith, but about control of belief, of perception, of destiny. Rome, at the time, was obsessed with omens. A comet, an eclipse, a sudden storm, all were seen as signs from the heavens. Caesar began to appear as though he were guided by these signs, as though fate itself conspired in his favour. Whether he truly believed it or not no longer mattered. Others did, and as his fame grew, so too did the distance between him and the Senate. The aristocrats saw themselves as guardians of the Republic, yet they had become prisoners of their own vanity. They bickered over titles and property, while the city fell deeper into chaos. Caesar used this dysfunction masterfully. He positioned himself as the only man capable of saving Rome from itself. He once told an ally, "Men will follow the one who listens when others speak too much." That principle guided him in every arena. In debates, he rarely interrupted. He would listen, nod, and then speak with such calm authority that even his opponents felt the weight of his reason. But beneath that polished voice, there was steel. Those who crossed him found themselves quietly ruined, contracts revoked, supporters lost, reputations poisoned. Caesar's vengeance was never loud, but it was absolute. Still, to the people, he remained a hero. He opened granaries during famine, hosted banquets for veterans, and ensured public works gave jobs to the poor. Rome's lower classes began to chant his name as a prayer. "Caesar! Caesar!" they cried in the streets, and he would raise a hand modest, gentle, but commanding. The Senate tried to curb him. They passed laws to limit extravagance, to cut back on public spending, to remind the Republic that it was still ruled by men, not idols. Caesar simply smiled, nodded, and ignored them. At one festival, Cato confronted him directly, accusing him of buying Rome's soul with bread and games. Caesar responded with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Then perhaps, Cato, you should try feeding her once in a while." The crowd erupted in laughter. Cato stormed out. From that day forward, the Senate's power began to crumble further, not because Caesar attacked it, but because he had made it irrelevant. While they debated, he acted. While they schemed, he inspired. And Rome, fickle, hungry, adoring Rome, followed the man who made them feel alive. In the evenings, Caesar would return to his villa on the Palatine Hill. The torches outside flickered against the marble, casting long shadows across the columns. Inside, the air was quiet except for the scratching of scribes recording his correspondence. He would stand at the window overlooking the city, hearing the distant noise of the crowd still calling his name. He rarely smiled then. Alone, his expression was neither proud nor triumphant, but focused as if listening to something deeper than applause. The sound of the wind across the rooftops, the whisper of destiny moving closer. He knew he could not remain a priest and politician forever. The Republic was too unstable, its factions too fractured. If he was to fulfill his vision, he would need an army. An army meant war. War meant glory. Glory meant power that no Senate decree could touch. He had already mastered the city. Now he would master the world. The people of Rome did not yet know that their favorite son was preparing to leave them, not to abandon them, but to return as something far greater. They would see his name carved on victory monuments, hear it shouted in marketplaces from Gaul to the Alps. His face, once painted on walls by humble artisans, would soon be stamped on coins, gleaming beneath the sun. And one day, when he walked those streets again, the people would not shout "Caesar the priest" or "Caesar the generous." They would shout a new word, one that meant ruler, conqueror, and God all at once. Caesar the invincible, but for now, under the torchlight of Rome, the master of the masses stood at the edge of his next great transformation, poised between man and myth, waiting for the call of war that would carry him into eternity. The triumvirate. The Senate chamber smelled of oil lamps and cold marble. Outside, the city groaned with noise, vendors shouting in the forum, soldiers marching through the cobbled streets, beggars crying for bread. The Republic was alive, but it was a tired, trembling creature, staggering under the weight of its own ambitions. Senators clung to the illusion of control, while the real power of Rome began to shift elsewhere, to the generals who commanded its armies and the men who could command its people. Among these men, 3 names ruled every conversation: Gnaeus, Pompeius, Magnus, known as Pompey the Great, Marcus, Licinius, Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and Gaius Julius Caesar, the restless rising star whose charm could melt crowds and whose will could cut through marble. They were 3 different kinds of power. Pompey held the sword, Crassus held the gold, and Caesar held the hearts of the people. And in a republic rotting from division, those 3 forces together could do what the Senate could not bend Rome itself. But alliances in Rome were not born of friendship. They were forged in necessity. Pompey had returned from his eastern campaigns drenched in glory. He had subdued kingdoms, toppled kings, and brought back wealth beyond imagining. Yet, when he returned to the Senate, seeking land for his veterans and the ratification of his settlements, the senators turned their backs on him. They feared him more than they respected him. Crassus, meanwhile, sat atop mountains of gold. His estates stretched across Italy. His wealth filled entire treasuries. But gold, in Rome, was not enough. Crassus wanted recognition, the kind that no amount of coin could buy. He had crushed the slave revolt of Spartacus years before, yet the glory had been stolen by Pompey. The wound still burned, and Caesar, still deep in debt, still technically the lesser of the three, watched both men and smiled. He understood what they needed, and more importantly, what he could offer. He offered unity not out of loyalty, but strategy. In whispered meetings held in shaded gardens and lamplit villas, the idea took shape. A private agreement between three of Rome's most powerful men to support one another, to share influence, to dominate the Republic from within. History would call it the first triumvirate, a word that meant rule of three. But in truth, it was Caesar's creation. The terms were simple and devastating. Crassus would provide financial backing. Pompey would lend his military strength and prestige. Caesar would act as the bridge, the public face, the voice of the people, the engine of their collective ambition. Together, they would control elections, laws, and appointments. No decree would pass without their blessing. To seal the pact, Caesar offered Pompey something personal: marriage. Not his own, but that of his beloved daughter Julia to Pompey himself. It was a bond that startled Rome. Julia was young and radiant. Pompey much older, but the union transformed political alliance into family. Caesar knew the symbolism mattered more than the sentiment. When news of the triumvirate spread through the Senate, it struck like thunder. The Optimates, the conservative faction, were horrified. Cato raged in the chambers, calling it a betrayal of the Republic. Cicero, ever eloquent and cautious, lamented that Rome was no longer governed by law, but by men. Yet there was nothing they could do. The balance of power had shifted. The first fruit of the alliance was Caesar's election as consul in 59 BCE. It was the highest office in the Republic, the pinnacle of Roman political life. But for Caesar, it was not a crown. It was merely the key to unlock everything that would follow. He shared the consulship with Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, a bitter opponent and puppet of the Senate. From the very beginning, the two clashed. Bibulus tried to block Caesar's reforms, to halt his new laws for land distribution and citizenship. But Caesar, ever the strategist, outmaneuvered him with ease. He brought his bills directly before the people, bypassing the Senate entirely. When Bibulus tried to disrupt a public assembly, Caesar's supporters showered him with insults and drove him off with buckets of dung. Humiliated, Bibulus retreated into seclusion, claiming to watch the skies for omens. For the rest of their joint term, the city joked that it was the consulship of Julius and Caesar. With Bibulus gone, Caesar reigned alone. His legislation was bold and radical. He granted land to veterans and the poor, restored rights to those who had been dispossessed by Sulla's purges, and strengthened Pompey's eastern settlements. The people adored him more than ever. His speeches brought tears, laughter, and thunderous applause. His face appeared on murals and coins. Even the gods seemed to smile upon him, but power came with a price. The Senate accused him of tyranny, of undermining their authority. He ignored them, smiling that calm, dangerous smile that drove his enemies mad. When Cato tried to filibuster his proposals, Caesar had him dragged from the chamber. The message was clear. The age of hesitation was over. When his term as consul ended, tradition required Caesar to accept a governorship. Normally, such posts were brief and minor, but the triumvirate ensured that his command was exceptional. 5 years in Gaul, with authority over several legions. It was an appointment that shocked his rivals. Gaul was vast, rich, and wild, a frontier of immense opportunity. To most senators, it seemed like exile disguised as reward. They expected Caesar to vanish into obscurity, to spend years warring against barbarian tribes and fade from Rome's memory. They were wrong. Caesar saw what they could not. Gaul was the gateway to immortality. He departed Rome in 58 BCE, leaving behind a city that loved him, hated him, and feared what he might become. As he rode north, the streets filled with crowds shouting his name. Some tossed flowers, others cursed. Both were music to his ears. He paused on the outskirts of the city and looked back at its skyline, the temples, the Senate house, the golden light shimmering on the Tiber. He whispered something to himself, words lost to history, and then turned his horse toward destiny. The journey to Gaul was long and harsh. The roads wound through forests, over mountains, across rivers swollen with rain. His legions followed young, eager, loyal. They did not yet know that they were marching into the most extraordinary campaign of the ancient world, a war that would last nearly a decade and change both Caesar and Rome forever. Before he left Italy, he made a final gesture to bind his power. He renewed his alliances. Crassus would continue to fund him, ensuring his debts would not drown him while he was gone. Pompey would remain in Rome, maintaining political control and serving as his voice in the Senate. It was a delicate balance. Each man believed he was using the other. But Caesar, patient as ever, knew that the triumvirate was not a partnership, it was a ladder, and once he reached the top, he would no longer need to share it. In Gaul, he would find more than conquest. He would find the narrative that would turn him from a politician into a legend, from a general into a god. The Senate thought they had sent him away. In truth, they had set him free. As his army crossed the border, the wind carried the scent of pine and the distant sound of thunder. The land ahead was vast, untamed, and waiting to be written into history. Caesar raised his hand, his soldiers halting behind him. He spoke quietly, but every man heard his words. "We are Rome," he said, "and Rome does not stop at her borders." The legions roared in reply, their voices echoing into the forests of the north. In that moment, under the grey sky of a foreign land, Julius Caesar stepped beyond the limits of the Republic and toward the empire he would one day create. The conquest of Gaul, the wind over Gaul was colder than anything that blew through the marble streets of Rome. It carried the scent of pine and iron, of wood smoke and distant rain. For most Romans, this northern land was the edge of the known world, wild, untamed, inhabited by fierce tribes who painted their bodies and worshipped strange gods beneath the moon. But for Julius Caesar, Gaul was not a wilderness. It was a canvas. He had arrived with 4 legions, nearly 20,000 men, veterans, farmers, and wanderers hardened by years of marching. Behind them came supply trains, engineers, scribes, and ambitions that stretched farther than any map. When they crossed into Transalpine Gaul, they were not only soldiers, they were builders of a story. The tribes of Gaul, the Helvetii, the Belgae, the Arverni, and a dozen others, had lived in fragile balance for centuries, trading with Rome and fighting among themselves. Caesar knew how to exploit division. He was not simply a general of swords, he was a general of minds. When the Helvetii, a vast migrating tribe, began moving westward, burning their villages behind them, Caesar saw opportunity. He portrayed their movement as a threat to Roman allies and declared war in the name of defense. It was a lie, but in Rome, lies became laws when spoken with conviction. He ordered his legions to block the Helvetii's path at the Rhone. Day and night, his men worked to build fortifications, massive earthworks and palisades stretching for miles. The sound of hammers echoed through the valley, mingling with the low chant of the soldiers. Caesar himself walked among them, cloak wrapped tight, giving orders in a voice calm and steady. He ate their rations, drank their water, and slept in a simple tent among the men. When the Helvetii arrived, expecting to cross unopposed, they found not weakness but a wall of iron and discipline. Their warriors hurled spears and insults, but the Romans did not move. When Caesar finally gave the order, it was like lightning unleashed. The battle was brutal, and fast mud, blood, and steel beneath the summer sun. The Helvetii fought bravely, but Rome's machines of war ground them down. After the victory, Caesar did not exterminate them. Instead, he ordered the survivors to rebuild their villages. Mercy, he knew, was another form of control. He wanted loyalty, not ashes. The message spread across Gaul. Caesar could destroy, but he preferred to command. The tribes watched and trembled. Some sent envoys bearing gifts, others prepared for war. The greatest resistance came from Ariovistus, a Germanic warlord who had crossed the Rhine with tens of thousands of men. He was tall, brutal, and proud, a mirror of what Caesar might have been if born among barbarians instead of marble. When their armies finally met near the Vosges Mountains, the battle became legend. Caesar's men, outnumbered and exhausted, fought with desperate ferocity. Trumpets blared through the mist. The ground shook beneath the charge. At one point, Caesar himself seized a shield from a fallen soldier and stood in the front line, rallying his men with words that burned through fear. "If you falter, Rome falters. Stand with me, and the gods themselves will remember your names." They stood, they fought, and they won. Ariovistus fled across the Rhine, his army shattered. Caesar had driven back not only an invader, but a symbol proof that Rome's reach could extend beyond its borders, that no tribe, no god, no barbarian could stand against its will. From that moment, the campaign in Gaul became something larger. It was not just conquest, it was transformation. Caesar began to write reports to the Senate, the famous Commentarii de Bello Gallico, accounts that turned his military deeds into epic literature. He described the enemy with respect, but always ended with the same quiet refrain: they resisted Rome, and they were broken. Each dispatch served two purposes. To the Senate, it was information. To the people, it was theatre. His words were read aloud in the forum, where citizens gathered in awe. They imagined Caesar marching through forests of snow and flame, standing unflinching before barbarian kings. To them, he became something more than a general, he became a myth. For 8 long years, Caesar fought in Gaul. He crushed the Belgae in the north, subdued the Nervi after a ferocious battle that nearly cost him his life, and pacified countless smaller tribes. He crossed the Rhine into Germania, the first Roman commander ever to do so, building a bridge of timber that stretched across the roaring river in only 10 days, a feat so astonishing that it silenced even his critics. When the bridge was complete, he marched his army across, stood upon the far bank for 18 days, and then, having proven his point, dismantled the bridge and withdrew. It was not war, it was a message. Rome can go wherever Caesar wills. Then came Britain. The misty island had long been the stuff of rumour, a place of druids and silver, where the sun barely rose and the sea swallowed ships whole. No Roman army had ever landed there. Caesar decided he would be the first. The crossing was perilous. Storms tore through the fleet. Ships splintered against jagged coasts. His men, knee-deep in icy water, fought off Britons painted in blue woad. Spears flashed, waves crashed, and Caesar himself plunged into the surf to rally his troops. They took the beach, though they could not hold it long. But again, victory was not the point. It was the image. Caesar standing in the surf, sword raised against the edge of the world. Each victory brought him wealth beyond imagining, plunder, tribute, and slaves. His legions grew stronger, their loyalty absolute. They would follow him anywhere, through storm and fire. They called him Imperator, not as a title of office, but as a word of devotion. Back in Rome, however, his enemies seethed. The Senate watched his rise with dread. His letters dripped with triumph, his coffers overflowed, and his name filled every mouth. Pompey, once his ally, and now his uneasy equal, grew jealous of his glory. Crassus, restless for fame of his own, led an ill-fated campaign eastward against the Parthians, a disaster that ended with his death and the scattering of his army. With Crassus gone, the triumvirate began to crumble. What had once been a triangle of balance was now a line drawn between two men, Caesar and Pompey, and it was growing taut, ready to snap. But for now, in Gaul, Caesar stood at the height of his power. He had conquered lands stretching from the Rhine to the Atlantic, enslaved millions, and brought unimaginable wealth to Rome. Yet, amid the spoils of victory, he remained restless. At night, in his campaign tent, he would read by lamplight the murmurs of his soldiers drifting beyond the canvas. Maps and letters lay scattered before him, not of Gaul, but of Rome. He knew that his true war was not here among forests and rivers. It was waiting for him back in the marble halls he had left behind. The Senate would never let him return, as he was too popular, too powerful, too dangerous. Pompey now commanded Rome's legions, his loyalty uncertain, and Caesar, stripped of his command, would stand trial for the very power he had won in Rome's name. He was no fool. The Republic feared him more than any barbarian ever had, so he began to plan. Every road, every victory, every heartbeat of conquest had led to one inevitable decision. He would not surrender power. He would claim it, and one winter night, as the snow fell softly outside his tent in Gaul, Julius Caesar sealed his resolve. When the time came, he would not return to Rome as a subject. He would return as its master. The crossing of the Rubicon. Winter settled over Gaul like a grey shroud. The fields were empty, the rivers hard with ice, and the campfires of Caesar's legions glowed like stars in the cold valleys. For nearly a decade, they had followed him through forests, across mountains, over seas. They had seen him fight on the front lines, had shared his bread, had buried their dead beneath foreign skies. To them, Caesar was not merely a commander. He was Rome itself. But Rome no longer agreed. Far to the south, in the marble echo of the Senate House, his enemies had been gathering. Pompey now sat at the heart of power, wrapped in titles and flattery, the darling of the aristocrats who once despised him. They whispered that Caesar's term in Gaul was ending, that he must return to Rome to face trial for corruption and treason. They said his conquests had made him too proud, too dangerous, that the Republic must be protected from its most brilliant sun. In the quiet of his tent, Caesar read their letters by candlelight. Cicero's polished sentences, Cato's bitter condemnations, the formal decrees demanding his disbandment all dripped with venom cloaked in civility. Each word was another dagger. He knew their plan: strip him of his command, prosecute him in court, and ruin him forever. To surrender meant humiliation. To resist meant civil war. And so he waited, patient, calculating. He had written his final reports from Gaul with the same precision he brought to battle. Each dispatch was a performance of restraint. He spoke of peace, of loyalty to Rome, of his desire only for fair treatment. But behind those careful phrases was iron. He knew that every speech he sent was read aloud in the forum, where the common people still adored him. They had cheered his victories, chanted his name, lived off the spoils of his wars. The Senate might condemn him, but the streets still belonged to Caesar. The months dragged on, the tension tightened. Envoys passed between Caesar and Pompey, pretending to negotiate, but every word brought them closer to war. When the Senate finally voted, declaring Caesar an enemy of the state if he did not lay down his arms, the decision was irreversible. The Republic had chosen fear over loyalty. The night the news reached him, the camp was silent. Snow drifted between the tents. Torches flickered low. Caesar stood outside his pavilion, cloak drawn tight, staring into the darkness. He said little. Those who served him later swore that he spoke only one sentence: "The die is cast." But that moment had not yet come. Before dawn, he called his officers together. The generals gathered around a wooden table, maps spread beneath their hands, the candlelight trembling on their faces. They argued, some begged him to submit, to return quietly to Rome and fight his case in the Senate. Others demanded immediate war, their voices hot with loyalty and revenge. Caesar listened, patient as always, his fingers tracing the map. Finally, he looked up. His voice was soft, but it cut through the room like a blade. "If I cross the Rubicon," he said, "there will be no turning back. If I return to Rome as a private citizen, I return in chains. If I return with my legions, I return as master. Which shall it be?" Silence answered him. Every man knew the weight of that choice. The Rubicon, a small, shallow river marking the boundary between his province and Italy, was more than a stream. It was a line drawn between obedience and revolution. To cross it with an army was treason. It meant war against the Republic itself. For a long time, no one spoke. Then his closest officer, Marcus Antonius, stepped forward and said, "We will follow you, whatever river lies ahead." "Aye," Caesar nodded once. The decision was made. They broke camp under a moonless sky. The wind howled through the trees as thousands of soldiers moved in silence, their armor muffled beneath cloaks, their torches hidden. Snow crunched beneath their boots. They carried standards bearing the Eagle of Rome symbols that now, for the first time, marched not for the Senate, but for one man. By dawn, they reached the banks of the Rubicon. The river shimmered under pale winter light, shallow and quiet, as if mocking the weight of history it carried. Caesar rode to the edge and dismounted. For a moment, he stood motionless, watching the current slide past his boots. He thought of Rome, of the marble temples, the shouting senators, the people who had cheered his name. He thought of the Republic that had once been his home, and now saw him as its enemy. He thought of Sulla's purges, of the fear that had once driven him into exile. And then, with a deep breath, he stepped forward. The water splashed cold against his legs as he crossed. His soldiers followed, their armor glinting in the grey light. Someone shouted, "Hail, Caesar!" and the cry was taken up by hundreds of voices. The sound rolled across the river like thunder. When they reached the far bank, Caesar turned to his men and raised his hand. "Comrades," he said, "we cross not a river, but the boundaries of a world. The Senate would have us slaves. We will show them Rome still belongs to its conquerors." It was not bravado. It was prophecy. From that moment, there was no return. The news reached Rome like lightning. Senators fled in panic. Pompey gathered what legions he could and retreated south to Greece. The streets boiled with rumors. Some said Caesar would bring fire and blood to the capital. Others said he came as a liberator. In truth, he came with astonishing restraint. His army marched swiftly down the Italian peninsula, but there was no looting, no burning, no revenge. City after city opened its gates. The people cheered. Governors who once served the Senate now bent the knee. Caesar moved like a storm fast, inevitable, unstoppable. He wrote to Pompey offering peace, even as he seized every strategic point along the way. It was brilliance disguised as mercy. In only 60 days, he controlled all of Italy. When he entered Rome, he rode not as a conqueror, but as a statesman. There were no trumpets, no parades. He walked through the forum in silence, past the statues of the old heroes, past the Senate house that now stood nearly empty. The marble floor still echoed with the memory of arguments, but the voices were gone. At the Temple of Saturn, he stopped and looked up at the sky. The winter sun shone through drifting clouds, glinting off the bronze armor of the guards. He murmured something to himself, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a promise. Then he went to work. He restored order, reinstated magistrates, reopened the granaries. He forbade retaliation against those who had opposed him. The Senate, trembling, reconvened and formally recognized his authority. But Caesar knew peace could not last. Pompey still lived, gathering his legions across the sea. The Republic would not die quietly. As spring approached, Caesar left Rome again, leaving behind a garrison and the illusion of calm. His armies marched through the Apennines toward Spain, where Pompey's allies were regrouping. In every town they passed, the people poured into the streets to greet him. Children ran beside his horse. Old men wept. To them, he was not the destroyer of the Republic, but its savior, the man who had defied the corruption of the Senate and promised a new order. He played the role perfectly, smiling, speaking softly, offering hope. In the evenings, by the campfire, he wrote. His pen was as sharp as his sword. In his journals, he described the campaign not as rebellion, but as necessity, a noble defense of liberty. If Rome falls, he wrote, it will not be by the sword of Caesar, but by the cowardice of those who fled her. Those who fought beside him felt the force of his belief. To march under Caesar was to feel history breathing at one's back. Even the veterans who had followed him for years spoke of his strange serenity, the calm of a man who never doubted his purpose. Yet in his private moments, when the fires burned low and the wind carried the smell of pine and smoke, Caesar sometimes stared into the distance, his face unreadable. He knew what he had unleashed. Once before, Sulla had marched on Rome and remade the Republic in blood. Now, Caesar had done the same, but where Sulla ruled through terror, Caesar would rule through vision. He did not want Rome to fear him. He wanted it to need him. He was no longer a mere general, nor even a politician. He was becoming something else, something Rome had not seen in centuries. A man who carried not just power, but destiny. As his legions crossed the plains of northern Italy, banners snapping in the wind, the people began to whisper a new name for him. They called him Father of the Republic. He smiled when he heard it. Not because he believed it, but because he knew it was the beginning of something far greater. For the Republic was dying, and like all dying things, it would call its killer a savior before the end. Civil war. The sky over Italy was a dull, uneasy grey when Julius Caesar began his march southward. Behind him trailed the rumble of legions, the steady rhythm of thousands of boots striking ancient roads, the metallic pulse of empire in motion. He had crossed the Rubicon. Now there was no turning back. What had begun as a political feud had become something far greater, the death struggle of the Republic itself. Rome was no longer merely a city. It was a prize, a symbol of all civilization. And now, two men who had once called each other allies, Pompey and Caesar, prepared to fight for its soul. Pompey had fled east, gathering his strength in Greece. There, among the marble ports and old kingdoms of the Hellenic world, he summoned the legions loyal to the Senate men who saw themselves as defenders of order against Caesar's audacity. He controlled the seas and had the support of most of Rome's governors. The Senate called him Magnus the Great. Caesar's power was smaller, but his will was sharper. He commanded veterans hardened by a decade of conquest in Gaul, men who had followed him through snow, blood, and endless marches, who had seen him ride into battle beside them rather than above them. To them, he was not just a commander, he was destiny made flesh. When he entered Rome, the city opened to him without a fight. The senators who had stayed behind bowed in fear or calculation. Caesar moved swiftly, securing the treasury, seizing supplies, issuing decrees in calm precision. He forbade looting, ordered the markets reopened, and even had guards posted at Pompey's own house to prevent its ransacking. The people were astonished. They had expected slaughter. Instead, they saw discipline. But Caesar's heart was not in Rome. It was across the sea, where Pompey waited with armies twice his size. Before he could pursue him, Caesar had to secure the west. Spain, under Pompey's generals, remained hostile. So, without rest, he turned his legions toward the Pyrenees. The campaign that followed was swift, brutal, and brilliant. His marches were lightning fast, his tactics unpredictable. He moved his troops through mountain passes where no army had dared before, appearing where the enemy thought him weeks away. At Ilerda, after weeks of maneuver and siege, Caesar trapped Pompey's lieutenants between flood and famine. They surrendered without a final battle. Instead of killing them, Caesar spared them, sending them home unharmed. It was not mercy, it was message. War, he wrote later, is won as much by forgiveness as by fear. From Spain he returned east, his momentum unstoppable. Each victory added to his legend. Each spared enemy became another whisper that Caesar was not Sulla's heir, but something new, a conqueror who preferred to build rather than destroy. By the time he reached Brundisium, Pompey had already fled across the Adriatic. The Senate, clinging to him, had declared that no compromise could be made. Caesar stood on the shore, watching the last of Pompey's ships vanish into the blue horizon. He smiled faintly. "He carries the Senate with him," he said, "but the people remain with me." He needed ships to follow, but the fleet was scarce, and the seas were dangerous. Months passed as he secured resources, prepared his men, and restored stability to Italy. The people adored him now, the man who had brought order without terror. He walked among them freely, unguarded, as though certain no blade could harm him. At last, the ships were ready. The crossing was perilous winter winds, treacherous waters, yet Caesar would not wait. He embarked with a small force, leaving the rest to follow later. The voyage was long and stormy. Waves crashed against the hull, and lightning tore through the clouds. At one point, his ship nearly capsized. The helmsman begged to turn back, but Caesar, drenched and unflinching, shouted above the roar, "Fear nothing! You carry Caesar and his fortune!" The storm broke, and the ship survived. His men never forgot it. When they landed in Greece, they found Pompey waiting his camp vast, glittering with senators, banners, and the gold of the Republic. The old general still believed in the superiority of numbers, in the weight of tradition. He thought Caesar's army, tired and undersupplied, would crumble before the might of lawful Rome. He was wrong. The first clash came at Dyrrhachium, near the Adriatic coast. Caesar's troops built walls around Pompey's massive camp, not to attack, but to contain. It was a duel of patience, of cunning. Pompey tried to starve him out, and for a moment the strategy worked. Caesar's men grew gaunt and weak, eating roots and stale grain, but their loyalty did not break. They swore that as long as Caesar stood, they would not yield. When a breach opened in their line, Pompey struck, and for the first time, Caesar tasted near defeat. His troops faltered, his camp was nearly taken. Yet, even in retreat, Caesar maintained calm. He rallied his men with words that would echo through history. "Today's loss is not of courage, but of luck. We shall have both again." And indeed, they would. Weeks later, the two armies met again at Pharsalus, in the broad plains of Thessaly. The dawn was red, the air heavy with dust and anticipation. Pompey's army outnumbered Caesar's nearly 2-1. The senators stood on nearby hills, confident they would soon watch the rebellion end. Caesar rode before his lines, bareheaded, the wind tugging at his cloak. "They are more in number," he told his soldiers, "but not in heart. The Senate fights for privilege. We fight for Rome." Then the trumpets sounded. The Battle of Pharsalus was chaos, smoke, screams, the thunder of cavalry. Caesar's tactics were unorthodox. He kept a hidden reserve of infantry behind his front lines, ordering them to attack at the precise moment Pompey's cavalry charged. The trap worked perfectly. Pompey's proud horsemen broke, then fled. Panic rippled through his army. When it was over, the ground was littered with the fallen Romans killing Romans, the Republic devouring itself. Caesar stood amidst the wreckage, his armor dented, his sword dripping with the blood of men who had once called him friend. He looked across the field to where Pompey's tent still fluttered in the wind. But Pompey was gone. He had fled the battlefield, leaving his army to surrender. His generals, desperate and ashamed, threw down their weapons. Caesar did not gloat. He walked among the prisoners, speaking gently, offering them freedom. "We have shed enough Roman blood," he said. "The war is over." But the war was not over. Pompey fled across the sea again, this time to Egypt, seeking refuge with the young king Ptolemy XIII. Egypt was rich, unpredictable, and ruled in name by a child, and in truth by scheming courtiers. Caesar, learning of Pompey's flight, pursued him immediately, not out of vengeance, but necessity. Peace could not exist while Pompey lived. The voyage south was swift. As Caesar's ships neared Alexandria, a messenger approached a small boat carrying gifts from the Egyptian court. Among them, wrapped in linen, was a head, Pompey's head. The courtiers had thought to please Caesar by presenting his enemy's death as tribute, but when the cloth was lifted and Caesar saw the grey curls matted with blood, he turned away. His face hardened. His voice was low. "This was not how a Roman dies," he said. He wept not for Pompey the rival, but for Pompey the man who had once been his friend, his ally, his brother in power. He ordered a proper funeral and burned the body on the shore, the flames flickering against the Egyptian night. The smoke rose toward the stars, carrying with it the last breath of the Republic's old generation. Pompey was gone. The Senate's armies were broken. Caesar was now the most powerful man in the world, and yet, standing there beside the silent sea, watching the pyre burn low, he must have known what it meant. The Republic had died not by his hand alone, but by its own corruption, by years of greed and cowardice. He had not murdered it. He had merely buried what was already rotting. But even as he stared into the smoke, another fire was already kindling, one that would burn through marble and time itself. For in the golden halls of Alexandria, waiting beyond the palace gates, was a queen whose name would bind itself to his forever, Cleopatra. And through her, Caesar's story and Rome's would take its most seductive and perilous turn. The fall of Pompey, the waters of the Mediterranean lay still under a burning Egyptian sun. Caesar's ship cut through them silently, its crimson sails trembling in the wind, its bronze prow glinting like a blade. Behind him lay Pharsalus, the field of victory, of ruin, of Roman blood. Ahead lay Alexandria, jewel of the East, ancient city of light and learning, and there, he knew, waited the ghost of Pompey the Great. He had not come for vengeance. He had come for closure, to end the war that had split Rome in two, to reclaim the peace that he had promised when he first crossed the Rubicon. But as he neared the Nile Delta, Caesar felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze. He had conquered lands, armies, kings. Yet this journey would show him how fragile even victory could be. The Egyptian court was chaos. The throne of the Ptolemies was shared by two children, Ptolemy the 13th, not yet 15, and his older sister, Cleopatra the 7th. Each claimed divine descent from Isis and Osiris. Each claimed sole right to rule. Their advisors fought in whispers and assassinations. The kingdom, rich as it was, balanced on the edge of its own knife. When Caesar's ships anchored near the Pharos lighthouse, emissaries from Ptolemy's court hurried to greet him. They came bearing gifts, gold, grain, incense, and, above all, a token of loyalty they believed would please him most. A linen-wrapped bundle, carried with ceremony, was placed before him on deck. The chief envoy spoke proudly, his voice trembling in the hot wind. "Behold, noble Caesar, the gift of Egypt your enemy, Pompey, who fled to our shores and met the justice he deserved. Thus we prove our friendship to Rome and to you." The soldiers drew back the cloth. Inside lay the severed head of Pompey the Great, grey curls clotted with blood, the eyes still half open. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sea itself seemed to fall silent. Caesar stared down at what remained of the man who had once been his friend, his rival, his equal. Once they had shared wine and laughter. Once they had stood side by side to govern Rome. And now here he lay murdered, not in battle but in betrayal, cut down on foreign sands by cowards seeking favour. Caesar's face did not move, but those closest to him saw his jaw tighten, the faint tremor in his hand. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and cold. "This was not the death of a Roman," he said. "This was butchery." He ordered the head covered again. Then, against the protests of his officers, he commanded that Pompey be given the honours of a general's funeral. A pyre was built on the beach, the waves lapping gently at its edge. Caesar himself stood beside it as the flames rose, watching the smoke twist toward the sun. When at last the fire died, he turned away not in triumph, but in sorrow. "He was once great," he murmured, "and Rome, in killing him, has made itself smaller, yet the moment of mourning passed quickly. Caesar was not a man who allowed sentiment to linger long. The next morning, he entered Alexandria. The city shimmered with marble and gold, its streets alive with colour. Columns of red granite lined the boulevards. Statues of the gods gazed down with cold serenity. The scent of lotus and sea salt hung in the air. Above it all towered the library, that vast treasury of the world's knowledge, scrolls stacked higher than any temple. To Caesar, it felt like walking into the dream of an older civilization, but beneath its splendor, he sensed danger. Ptolemy's court received him with ceremony, musicians playing, dancers moving in slow circles of devotion, priests burning incense before his path. The boy king, draped in gold and linen, smiled with the practiced innocence of the ambitious. His advisors, however, were less subtle. They watched Caesar with suspicion, whispering in Greek and Egyptian, weighing the power that had come to their shores. For his part, Caesar declared himself a mediator, not a conqueror. He spoke of peace, of balance, of restoring order between the feuding siblings. But his presence alone was provocation. Egypt had not invited Rome. Rome had simply arrived. And then, quietly, came the woman who would change everything. Cleopatra. History would paint her in gold and shadow a seductress, a queen, a goddess. But when Caesar first saw her, she was neither crowned nor adorned. She had been in exile, driven from the city by her brother's faction. Desperate, cunning, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, rolled in a carpet, carried past guards who never guessed that Egypt's true ruler lay hidden in plain sight. When the carpet was unrolled before him, she rose in a cloud of linen and perfume, her dark eyes glittering like polished onyx. She did not bow. She simply smiled. "Am I welcome, Caesar?" He was stunned, though he hid it well. She was younger than he had expected, not yet 22, but her voice carried the poise of a monarch and the daring of a thief. She spoke fluent Greek and Latin, and when she laughed, it was soft, musical, and entirely unafraid. He saw in her what he saw in himself. Ambition wrapped in grace, intelligence sharpened by hardship. She was, like him, a creature born to command. Their alliance was instant, inevitable. He would restore her to the throne. She would offer Egypt's wealth and loyalty to Rome. But something deeper stirred between them. Admiration, fascination, and perhaps something that even Caesar, master of self-control, could not fully define. The palace trembled with rumour. Courtiers whispered that the Roman had fallen under her spell. Soldiers joked that Caesar had conquered half the world, only to surrender to one woman. But in truth, their partnership was not seduction, it was strategy. Together, they reshaped Egypt's future. Caesar ordered the royal armies loyal to Ptolemy to disband. The boy king's advisors, furious, turned the city into a battlefield. Soldiers poured into the streets. Arrows hissed through the air. The marble courtyards ran with blood. The siege of Alexandria had begun. Caesar's forces, outnumbered and cut off, fortified themselves in the palace quarter. From the rooftops, they could see the city burning. Smoke from the harbour drifted toward the sky, and with it, the greatest loss of all. The flames spread to the docks, then to the warehouses, and from there to the great library. Thousands upon thousands of scrolls, the wisdom of centuries, were consumed. The fire reflected in the harbour like a second sun. Caesar stood watching, his expression unreadable. Perhaps he understood the irony, that even in victory, civilization always burned something precious. For weeks, the fighting raged. Supplies dwindled. The soldiers grew weary. Yet Caesar remained unshaken. His calm in battle was legendary, the same calm that had carried him across the Rhine and through storms at sea. He fought beside his men, shouting orders, wielding sword and torch. At last, reinforcements arrived from Asia Minor. The tide turned. Ptolemy's army broke, retreating into the Nile marshes. In the chaos, the boy king drowned his golden armour, dragging him beneath the weight of the river. The war was over. Cleopatra was queen again, restored to the throne by Caesar's hand. She appeared before her people in robes of gold, crowned with the diadem of Isis. Caesar sat beside her, a foreigner yet treated as divine. Together, they ruled Egypt for a brief, shining season, a union of empire and beauty, intellect and ambition. In the quiet of her palace, among the scent of jasmine and the flicker of oil lamps, their alliance deepened. Cleopatra bore him a son, Caesarion, a child who would carry both names, Roman and Egyptian, as though fate itself had tried to merge two civilizations through one bloodline. For Caesar, it was a rare moment of peace. He walked the gardens of the Nile, speaking softly with the queen about philosophy, about the stars, about the destiny of nations. He marveled at the temple hieroglyphs, at the priests' rituals that seemed to blend science and faith. Perhaps, for a heartbeat in that gilded world, he wondered what it might mean to rule not as a conqueror, but as a builder. But peace was never Caesar's natural state. Messages from Rome soon shattered the illusion. The Senate was in turmoil. The remnants of Pompey's faction had regrouped, led by the sons of the man whose head had once been presented to Caesar. They called themselves the Liberators, the true defenders of the Republic. Civil war, it seemed, was not finished. Caesar looked once more to the horizon to the west, where the future still called. He kissed Cleopatra's hand, promised her alliance and protection, and left Egypt with his legions. Behind him, the river gleamed gold in the dawn. Ahead, the world awaited its ruler's return. Pompey was gone, but his shadow lingered not in the man himself, but in the idea of the republic he had tried to preserve. Now Caesar would take up that idea, reshape it, and, if necessary, destroy it altogether. The queen and the general. The wind off the Nile carried the perfume of lotus and smoke, soft and heavy in the golden heat. From the balcony of the royal palace, Julius Caesar stood looking out over Alexandria, a city of marble and light, the jewel of an older world. The war was done. The boy king Ptolemy was dead, swallowed by the river that had once crowned him. And beside Caesar now stood Cleopatra, queen of Egypt, survivor, goddess, and flame. She had been restored to her throne through his command. But she was no puppet. She ruled with the calm poise of one who knew how fragile power truly was. Even now, as she leaned on the carved stone railing, her eyes never rested. She watched everything, the movement of the guards below, the servants carrying jars of wine, the banners fluttering against the sea breeze. Caesar admired her not because she was beautiful, though she was, her skin burnished by the sun, her hair dark as ink, but because she was dangerous. She spoke with the same precision that he wielded in speech and sword. She knew when to flatter, when to strike, when to hold her tongue. She had survived exile, assassination, and the ambitions of her own family. And in her, Caesar saw a reflection of himself. A ruler who had risen not from privilege, but from fire. For a few brief months, perhaps the only such months in his life, Caesar allowed himself to slow down. He moved through the palace gardens with her, under the whispering date palms and the calls of ibises on the water. He marveled at Egypt's age, its rituals, its monuments that had already stood for 2,000 years before Rome was born. The pyramids towered above the horizon like the bones of forgotten gods. Standing before them, Caesar felt the strange humility that only true greatness can inspire. "This," he said to Cleopatra one evening, as the desert wind scattered the sand around them, "is what Rome could become if it endures long enough." She smiled faintly, her gold bracelets catching the dying light. "Then endure, Caesar, but do not think your Rome eternal. The sands bury everything, even kings." He studied her face for a long moment. "Perhaps. But I intend to leave my mark deep enough that even the sands will hesitate." Their alliance deepened in the stillness of those days. What began as political necessity became fascination, and fascination became something gentler, though neither would ever call it love aloud. For two minds built for conquest, Affection itself became a form of strategy, an understanding born of mutual power. At night, they would dine together on the palace terrace, overlooking the moonlit city. Musicians played the lyre softly as the Nile shimmered below like liquid glass. Cleopatra spoke of Egyptian astronomy, of the orbits of the planets and the wisdom of her priests. Caesar countered with talk of Rome's laws and the geometry of war. Each impressed the other. Each tried to outshine the other. Each ended the evening with a deeper respect. He had found in her not a distraction, but an equal. And soon, she bore him a son. The child was named Caesarion, Little Caesar, born of two worlds, half Roman, half Egyptian, heir to the might of both civilizations. Cleopatra saw in him divine prophecy, the joining of sun and river, empire and eternity. Caesar saw something simpler, the proof that even destiny could be inherited. When word of the child reached Rome, the Senate was scandalized. Their Caesar priest, general, self-proclaimed guardian of Roman virtue, had taken a foreign queen as consort and fathered a son beyond the Republic. The whispers spread like wildfire, but Caesar, in Alexandria, remained unconcerned. He had already stopped caring what the Senate thought of him. Still, duty called him back. The Republic he had left behind was in chaos. Pompey's sons had raised legions in Africa, and the senators who had once fled with their fathers now dreamed of revenge. Caesar could not rest while his enemies still breathed. So, with winter's end, he prepared to leave. Cleopatra pleaded for him to stay for Egypt, for their son, but she knew even before she spoke that he would not. "You have conquered everything except your own hunger," she said. He smiled. That hunger built Rome. Their farewell was quiet, unceremonious. In the dawn light, his ship waited at the harbour, its sails furled and ready. Cleopatra came to see him off, her robes rippling in the wind like molten gold. The soldiers bowed as she passed, but Caesar did not. He reached for her hand, pressed it once, and said, "You will not be forgotten." "And you," she replied, "you will never rest." The oars struck the water, and the ship began to move. Cleopatra stood on the dock until it vanished into the horizon, her veil streaming behind her. Caesar's return to Rome was not the return of a soldier. It was the return of a god. The streets filled with people, shouting his name until the sound shook the temples. Flowers rained from the rooftops. Incense burned so thick that the city itself seemed to glow. His legions marched behind him, banners high, armor flashing in the sun. Captives from every corner of the known world, Gauls, Africans, Egyptians, were paraded through the streets, trophies of his conquests. It was not one triumph, but four, held over successive days. Each celebrated a different victory over Gaul, over Egypt, over Pontus, over Africa. The city had never seen such splendor. Yet through all the cheers, Caesar's face remained composed, almost detached. Triumph, he knew, was fleeting. Applause was a crown of smoke. That night, in his new marble villa on the Palatine Hill, he stood alone before a window, looking out over the lamps of Rome. The noise of celebration still drifted through the air, drums, flutes, drunken singing. He thought of Cleopatra's calm eyes, of the desert wind against his skin, of the whisper she had left him. "You will never rest." She had been right, for even in triumph, he was restless. The Senate bowed to him now, but he could feel their hatred under every compliment. The aristocrats smiled too quickly. Their toasts were too cold. They had once called him traitor. Now they called him dictator. The difference, he thought, was only a matter of timing. Still, he played his part. He hosted feasts, gave out grain, reduced debts, restored temples. The people adored him more than ever. They built statues of him in the Forum, crowned him with laurel wreaths, hailed him as father of the nation. And though he accepted it all with humility, the truth was clear. Caesar had become what every Roman secretly desired and publicly feared: a king without a crown. Even Cleopatra's presence lingered. Months after his return, she arrived in Rome, her arrival causing a storm of fascination and outrage. She came as a queen, not a supplicant, her son beside her. Caesar housed her in one of his estates across the Tiber. The city buzzed with gossip. Senators muttered that the conqueror of the world was now enslaved by a woman. Poets whispered of the witch of the Nile, but Caesar paid no attention. He entertained her publicly, spoke to her in the Senate's presence, even had statues of her raised beside those of Venus Genetrix, the divine ancestress of his own family. The message was unmistakable. He saw in Cleopatra not scandal, but sanctity, a mirror of his own greatness. And yet, their reunion was brief. Rome was not Egypt. Its marble glittered, but its air was heavy with suspicion. Caesar could feel the city closing in around him, the same way it had suffocated his predecessors. The more power he gathered, the more fragile it became. Still, for a while, he seemed untouchable. He rebuilt the calendar, established colonies, planned vast reforms that would last centuries. Every morning, his aides awoke to find new decrees written in his hand during the sleepless hours before dawn. He ruled with precision, with clarity, with vision, but somewhere in those long, relentless days, the warmth of the Nile faded. Cleopatra returned to Egypt, her ship vanishing down the Tiber at dusk, her sails catching the last rays of the Roman sun. Caesar watched from the balcony, his face expressionless, but his fingers tightening on the railing until his knuckles went white. Perhaps he knew that everything that had been human in him, love, sorrow, fatigue, was sailing away with her. He turned back into his house, into the bright marble corridors that echoed with his own footsteps, and resumed the work of remaking Rome. He had conquered Gaul, he had conquered Egypt, he had conquered his rivals. Now he would attempt the greatest conquest of all, to conquer Rome itself. Return to Rome. The marble city glittered in the Mediterranean sun, white and eternal against the blue of the sky. Rome, vast, hungry, radiant, had always been a city of noise and ambition, but now its heartbeat throbbed to the rhythm of one name: Caesar. When Julius Caesar returned from Egypt in triumph, he returned not as a general seeking approval, but as a ruler who no longer needed it. He entered the city not in fear of Senate decrees, nor with the nervous humility of lesser consuls before him. He came as the man who had already conquered the world. Behind him marched legions in perfect formation, their shields polished like mirrors, their spears rising in gleaming forests of bronze. Trumpets blared through the narrow streets, echoing off the old temples and marble colonnades. Flowers rained from balconies as citizens cheered his name. Ave, Caesar, father of the Republic, savior of Rome. It was more than celebration. It was worship. He had achieved what no Roman before him had dared to dream. He had subdued Gaul, tamed Egypt, and crushed every faction that had risen against him. The Senate trembled, but the people rejoiced. Bread was plentiful, debts forgiven, games endless. Rome had become an empire in all but name and Caesar, its beating heart. He entered the forum not as a man of politics, but as a symbol. The senators rose from their seats in cautious unison as he approached the curia. Some bowed deeply, others stared with tight jaws, their hands clenched in their togas. He greeted them with warmth, his tone generous, even gentle. He could afford to be kind. No one could oppose him now. His voice filled the chamber with the same calm force that had once commanded armies. He spoke of peace, of reform, of healing the Republic's wounds. He promised new colonies for veterans, fairer laws for the poor, mercy for those who had fled from him in war. He spoke not as a conqueror, but as a redeemer. It was the language of reconciliation, and yet, beneath it, there was command. The Senate named him dictator, first for 10 years, then, in time, for life. His statues multiplied across the city. Caesar crowned with laurel, Caesar enthroned like a god. His portrait adorned coins, his name became law. The Republic of the Old Fathers, the Rome of Brutus, Cato, and Cicero, had given way to something new. He began his reforms immediately. Roads were repaired, aqueducts extended, new temples raised. He overhauled the calendar, aligning it with the sun so that seasons would no longer drift the Julian calendar, a structure of time that would outlive empires. He expanded citizenship, planned libraries, and ordered the rebuilding of Carthage and Corinth, cities once destroyed by Roman vengeance. His vision was vast, his energy relentless. While others slept, Caesar worked writing, dictating, walking through half-finished buildings with architects at his side, discussing laws with philosophers before dawn. His aides complained they could not keep pace with him. His scribes collapsed from exhaustion at their desks. Yet for all his generosity, Caesar's power had no rival, and that frightened the Senate more than any cruelty could have. Cicero, that old master of rhetoric, murmured that Rome was no longer a republic, but a monarchy disguised in marble. Cassius and Brutus, men who had once fought beside him, now whispered in corners, speaking of liberty with bitterness in their throats. To them, Caesar's clemency was not kindness, it was humiliation. He had spared their lives after the war, but in doing so, had made them his debtors forever. He could have crushed them all, but he chose instead to embrace them. When Cicero returned from exile, Caesar welcomed him warmly and even restored his property. When Brutus, the son of his old lover Servilia, sought favour, Caesar made him a magistrate and spoke to him with paternal affection. "The past is ashes," he said. "We build anew." The Senate, cornered by his charm, began to turn its fear inward. Each decree in Caesar's favour passed with trembling voices. Each cheer of the people outside made the senators' blood run colder. To them, the Republic had always been about balance, about keeping any one man from holding too much power. But Caesar had redefined balance itself. He no longer stood within their system. He had become the system. Still, Caesar walked through this uneasy peace, as if unaware of the danger beneath it. His manner was calm, even playful. He joked with senators, dined with poets, planned public games with the enthusiasm of a young man. He could be seen walking alone in the forum, nodding to the crowd, smiling easily unguarded, almost careless. He believed, perhaps, that Rome loved him too much to harm him. But among the nobility, love and envy were never far apart. The more he gave to the people, the more the senators feared that the Republic itself was being devoured by his generosity. His golden throne in the Senate, his perpetual laurel wreath, his right to speak first in debate, each small honour became a reminder of their own fading importance. Then came the whispers, the most dangerous kind of rumour in all of Rome, that Caesar sought to make himself king. The word itself was poison. Rome had not suffered a king in 5 centuries. Every child in the city was raised on tales of the last, the tyrant Tarquin, cast out by Brutus the Elder when the Republic was born. To name oneself king was to erase Rome's soul. Caesar denied it. "I am no king," he said more than once. "I am Caesar. That is enough." But perception had already shifted. During the festival of the Lupercalia, Mark Antony, his loyal ally, offered him a golden crown before the cheering crowd. Caesar, smiling, pushed it away. The people roared approval, yet the Senate trembled, some believing it was theatre, others that it was a test. In that moment, his fate was sealed, though no one knew it yet. Despite the murmurs, Caesar continued his work. He planned a vast campaign to the east, a new conquest that would surpass even Alexander's march into Parthia and beyond. He intended to leave within the year, taking with him his legions and the future of Rome, but his absence terrified his enemies. What would happen if he conquered again? What would Rome become when he returned an emperor in all but name, untouchable, divine. The conspirators began to meet in secret. Brutus, Cassius, Decimus, Trebonius, names that history would remember in blood. They gathered in dimly lit atriums and gardens, cloaked in respectability. They spoke of restoring liberty, of saving the republic, of striking not at the man but at monarchy itself. Yet in their hearts, they knew it was not only liberty they sought, it was relevance. Rome no longer needed them. Caesar's shadow stretched too far. Meanwhile, the people adored their leader more than ever. When he walked the streets, crowds surged forward to touch his cloak, to call his name. Children climbed columns to glimpse him. Old veterans knelt, kissing his hands. He had become, without ever claiming it, what the senators feared most, a king beloved by his subjects. And yet, in private, Caesar remained strangely human. At night, when the lamps were low and the city fell silent, he would stand on his balcony overlooking the Forum, the moonlight gleaming on the marble of his temples. He would remember the snow of Gaul, the fires of Alexandria, the laughter of Cleopatra, the cries of victory that had followed him across the world. He had achieved everything a man could imagine, and yet, somewhere deep inside, he sensed that history never gives without taking in return. Still, he refused to change. He refused to fear. When an old soothsayer once warned him, "Beware the Ides of March," Caesar only smiled. "The Ides will come," he said lightly, "and so will Caesar." He was not arrogant, merely certain. Certain that destiny could not turn against him, because he was destiny. And so the days turned, one after another, bright and heavy with promise. Senators bowed in public and whispered in private. His friends began to glance over their shoulders. The streets seemed quieter, the air thicker. Rome held its breath. The man who had crossed the Rubicon, who had conquered the world, who had defied death itself, now stood at the height of his glory and the edge of his fate. The Ides of March. The morning of March 15th, 44 B.C., began softly, with the kind of fragile light that clings to Rome before the sun climbs high over its marble domes. The sky was pale gold, the air sweet with the faint scent of spring blossoms. Birds chattered in the cypress trees along the Palatine Hill, and the city was stirring from its sleep-bakers, lighting their ovens, senators rising from their couches, the rumble of carts echoing along the Via Sacra. In his villa above the Forum, Gaius Julius Caesar lay awake, long before dawn, staring at the painted ceiling. He had not slept well. The night had been heavy with dreams, dark and feverish. He saw himself floating through clouds, then standing before the gates of Jupiter's temple while blood rained softly upon the marble steps. He woke sweating, his chest tight, his heart strangely uneasy. Beside him, Calpurnia, his wife, stirred. She had dreamt 2 dreams of omens, of wolves howling, of his statue streaming blood, while Romans washed their hands in it. When she saw his face in the grey light, she clutched his hand. "Do not go to the Senate today," she whispered. "Something evil waits there." Caesar smiled, that same half-smile he had worn through every battle, every storm, every threat. "Evil waits for all men, my love, but I have lived too long to hide from it." He tried to reassure her, speaking of duties, of ceremonies, of omens misread. But Calpurnia clung harder, tears shining in her eyes. "The gods have sent warning," she said. "Do not mock them." Caesar hesitated. There had been warnings, strange ones. A lioness had given birth in the streets. Lightning had struck the Capitol's bronze statue of him, shattering its head from its shoulders. And just yesterday, a slave had caught sight of men sharpening daggers in the house of Brutus. He had laughed it off then, but now, in the stillness of morning, it returned to him like the echo of a whisper. Outside, his servants waited with his litter. The day's session promised celebration, new honours to be granted, new decrees to finalise before his departure for the East. The campaign against Parthia would be his last great act, the crowning conquest of a life already gilded in triumph. He rose and dressed in silence, His attendants draped him in a white toga with a border of crimson. Over his shoulders they placed the laurel wreath, gleaming still with dew. As they fastened his sandals, he glanced toward the balcony. Rome was waking smoke rising from rooftops, the Tiber flashing bronze beneath the rising sun. Calpurnia followed him to the doorway, still pleading. "Julius," she said softly, "if you love me, stay." 2024. He turned, touched her face, and said with a gentle finality, "The Senate waits for Caesar. Not even the gods will delay him." Then he was gone. The litter carried him down the winding road from the Palatine, past the great temples of Venus and Apollo, toward the Forum where marble shone like ice. Citizens bowed as he passed. Children shouted his name. The air hummed with reverence. He was Rome's father, her saviour, her living god. Halfway down the road, a hooded figure stepped from the crowd, the old soothsayer who months ago had warned him to beware this very day. Caesar, amused, ordered the bearers to halt. "Well," he said, smiling down, "the Ides of March have come." The old man looked up with milky eyes. "Aye, Caesar," he said gravely, "but they are not yet gone." For a moment, Caesar was silent. Then he laughed softly and waved for the litter to move on. Behind him, thunder murmured somewhere distant. The Senate met that day not in the Curia Hostilia, which was being repaired, but in Pompey's theatre, the grand hall Caesar's former rival had built years before. The irony of it did not escape him that he, the conqueror of Pompey, should sit in judgment beneath his enemy's marble gaze. The building gleamed in the morning light, its portico lined with statues of gods and heroes. At the top of the steps, Marcus Brutus stood waiting. His toga was immaculate, his posture calm, his face unreadable. He greeted Caesar with a bow, and for an instant there was warmth between them, the ghost of trust, of friendship. Brutus had once been almost a son to him. Caesar had pardoned him after Pharsalus, given him honours, placed him in the Senate again. Even now, he believed Brutus incapable of betrayal. Inside, the hall was crowded. The murmur of conversation filled the air like the hum of bees. Senators pressed forward to greet him too eagerly, some would say. They smiled, offered compliments, guided him toward his gilded chair near Pompey's statue. Above them, through the high windows, shafts of sunlight broke through clouds, falling across the polished marble floor. Dust swirled in the light, like drifting ash. Caesar took his seat. The voices quieted. He reached for the scrolls before him, glancing briefly at the agenda. Then, from the edge of the crowd, Tillius Cimber stepped forward, holding a petition. "Great Caesar," he said, "I beg a favour of pardon for my brother, exiled unjustly." Caesar waved a hand dismissively. "Your brother's case has been settled. Do not press me further." Cimber fell to his knees, clutching Caesar's toga. "I beg you, Caesar, mercy." Others stepped closer. Casca, Cassius, Brutus, forming a circle around him. "Stand aside," Caesar said sharply. "This is not the place." Then came the signal. Cimber seized the toga's edge and pulled it down from Caesar's shoulders. Casca drew a dagger and struck a clumsy blow that glanced off his collarbone. Caesar twisted, grabbing Casca's wrist. "Villain! What is this?" But even as he spoke, another dagger flashed, and another, and another. Steel slashed into his ribs, his thigh, his side. The senators surged forward like wolves. The hall erupted into chaos, robes whipping, sandals scraping against marble, cries of rage and terror blending into a single, terrible roar. Caesar tried to rise, but the blows came from every direction. Cassius stabbed him in the chest. Decimus struck his back. Blood sprayed across the floor, splattering Pompey's statue. He staggered, gasping, his strength fading. He looked into their faces, men he had spared, men he had raised to glory, men he had called friends, and then he saw Brutus. Brutus stood before him, dagger trembling in his hand, his eyes wide with anguish. For a long heartbeat, neither moved. "Brutus," Caesar whispered. His voice was not angry, nor accusing. It was only tired the voice of a man who had seen the world betray itself too many times. "You too?" Brutus hesitated, tears glinting in his eyes. Then, with a shuddering breath, he drove the dagger home. Caesar's knees buckled. He reached for the folds of his toga, drew them across his face, the gesture of a Roman noble accepting his fate with dignity. Then, without another word, he fell at the base of Pompey's statue. The silence that followed was unbearable. Only the drip of blood broke it, soft and steady against the marble. One by one, the assassins stepped back, panting, their daggers slick, their faces pale. Cassius raised his blade high. "Thus dies tyranny!" he shouted. No one cheered. Even they, who had struck the blows, could not quite believe what they had done. When they stumbled out into the daylight, their robes torn and spattered red, the crowd below recoiled. Rome had expected to see Caesar's triumph. Instead, it saw its god butchered. The people stared, frozen, as the senators proclaimed liberty. But liberty, it seemed, was silent. Back inside, the body lay alone. The golden wreath had rolled from his head. His toga was stained dark, clinging to his body like a shroud. Sunlight fell through the windows, touching his face. In death, he looked strangely peaceful, as though the long struggle was finally over. Mark Antony arrived moments later. Trebonius, one of the conspirators, had kept him outside during the killing. When he entered the hall and saw what had been done, he stopped dead, unable to breathe. Then he fell to one knee beside the body. "Great Caesar," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You have been betrayed not by enemies, but by those you loved." He touched the edge of the toga, his hand trembling. "You built a world for them," he said, and they tore it down. For a long time, he knelt there, the scent of blood and marble filling his lungs. Then, slowly, he rose. His face had changed. The grief in it hardened into something colder, a resolve born of vengeance. Outside, thunder cracked again across the sky, echoing through the streets of Rome. The Ides of March had come and gone, leaving the Republic drenched in the blood of its saviour. The senators fled in panic. The people wailed. The temples filled with terrified prayers. And from the shadows of the city, the future began to move the slow, unstoppable rise of those who would avenge him, and in doing so, end the Republic forever. On that marble floor, beneath the gaze of Pompey's statue, Caesar's blood was already beginning to dry, dark, thick, and eternal, a mark that even centuries of history could never wash away. The funeral of Caesar. The news spread through Rome like fire through dry grass. By midday, the word was on every tongue, whispered in every alley, cried from every street corner, "Caesar is dead." At first, the city did not believe it. How could it? Julius Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, the saviour of Rome, the man who defied the gods and never fell dead, murdered not by foreign blades but by Roman hands? The crowds surged through the streets, demanding answers. Some ran toward the theatre of Pompey, others toward the Forum, shouting his name like a prayer. By the time they reached the Senate, the murderers were already gone. They had fled to the Capitoline Hill, barricading themselves inside the Temple of Jupiter, their daggers still stained with the blood of the man they called tyrant. They told themselves that Rome would thank them, that the people would celebrate the return of liberty. But Rome did not cheer. Rome wept. Women tore their veils and scattered ashes over their hair. Veterans who had served under Caesar's banners threw down their swords in grief. Slaves gathered at the Forum gates, whispering that the sun itself seemed dimmer that day. The city, once roaring with noise and commerce, fell into stunned silence, and within that silence, something began to shift, something dangerous, heavy, and alive. The people's grief was not the quiet mourning of citizens for a lost statesman. It was the howling sorrow of children robbed of their father. For in Caesar they had seen not just a ruler, but a saviour. He had fed them, protected them, forgiven them. To them, The Senate's daggers had struck not at tyranny, but at Rome itself. When the body was finally carried from the Curia, wrapped in its blood-soaked toga, a wave of wailing followed it through the streets. The cortege moved slowly, a river of torches and tears winding toward the Forum. Mark Antony, now the highest-ranking official left alive in Rome, walked beside the bier, his face pale and grim, his eyes burning with a cold fury. Behind him came soldiers Caesar's veterans marching barefoot, their armour unpolished, their standards draped in black. Every step echoed against the stones. The air smelled of wax, incense, and rain. At the Forum, they laid him to rest upon a great marble platform beneath the open sky. His laurel wreath, bent and blood-stained, rested on his brow. His toga was torn in 23 places, each rip a wound that spoke louder than any speech. Rome gathered to see him one last time. From every hill and every alley they came merchants, senators, beggars, matrons, soldiers, slaves. There were so many that the Forum itself seemed to overflow, the crowd spilling into the surrounding streets. The conspirators had promised to appear to justify their deed before the people. But when they looked down from the Capitol and saw the sea of faces below, they faltered. Liberty, it seemed, had fewer voices than grief, and so the task of speaking for Caesar fell to one man, Mark Antony. When he stepped onto the platform, the crowd fell silent. He wore no armour, no crown, no ornament, only a simple toga darkened with mourning. For a long moment he said nothing, only looked out over the multitude before him. The wind stirred the hem of his robe. The sky had grown grey, the first drops of rain beginning to fall. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle. Romans, friends, countrymen, the crowd stirred, recognizing the familiar cadence of his speech, the tone of reason, not rage. "I come not to praise Caesar," he said, "but to bury him." He paused, letting the words hang in the damp air. "The senators who slew him call him ambitious, and they are honourable men, so they say. Yet, what cause have they to call him so?" He gestured to the body behind him. "You all did love him once, not without cause. What cause withholds you, then, from mourning him now?" A murmur rippled through the crowd, low and uncertain. Antony's voice grew stronger. "He hath brought many captives home to Rome, whose ransoms did fill our treasury. Did this in Caesar seem ambitious?" He pointed toward the soldiers in the front ranks. "You, who marched with him through Gaul and over the Alps, did ambition make him share your rations when food was scarce? Did ambition drive him to walk beside you in the mud and cold, when other generals sat in their tents? Did ambition make him weep for his men?" The crowd began to roar, the first rumblings of anger beneath the grief. Antony waited, then lifted his hands for silence. "You have heard how the senators stabbed him. 23 times they struck, and yet not one wound was mortal until Brutus, whom Caesar loved, raised his hand." He turned, lifting the torn toga for all to see. This was the unkindest cut of all, for when Caesar saw his Brutus among them, then he gave up the ghost, then burst his mighty heart. A cry went up, raw and furious. The rain began to fall harder, washing crimson streaks from the cloth. Antony's voice rose over the storm. "You all do know this mantle. Look, here is the rent that Casca made. See where Cassius struck, and here, where Brutus plunged his dagger. Look how the blood followed it, as if rushing forth to find if Brutus were truly his friend." He dropped the toga and turned to the bier. "You have not seen what I have seen. For when the noble Caesar fell, his eyes were open not in rage, not in pain, but in sorrow, sorrow that Rome could not love what it had made." The crowd began to weep. Women tore their hair, men beat their chests. Then Antony gave the signal. Servants lifted a small chest onto the platform. "Here," he said, "are Caesar's papers. His will." The murmuring rose. The senators who stood nearby exchanged uneasy glances. Antony unfolded the parchment, his voice steady but trembling with passion. "To every citizen of Rome," he read, "Caesar leaves 75 drachmas." The crowd gasped. "To every district of this city, he leaves gardens, parks, and fountains for your pleasure. To the veterans, he leaves land. To the poor, food. To Rome itself, his fortune." Antony let the will fall from his hand. "Was this ambition?" he shouted. "Was this tyranny? Was this the act of a man who sought to enslave you?" The people screamed, the roar of thousands rolling like thunder through the forum. "No!" they cried. "Revenge! Revenge for Caesar!" The soldiers drew their swords, shouting his name. The mob surged forward, pressing toward the platform, their grief transforming into fury. Antony raised his arms once more. "Here was a man," he cried. "When comes such another?" The answer came not in words, but in action. Someone hurled a torch. It landed at the foot of the bier, then another and another. Flames licked upward, bright against the rain. The fire took hold quickly, crackling through the wood, climbing the platform. The heat rose, the smoke curling into the grey sky. The people sobbed and shouted, tossing flowers, coins, weapons into the pyre. Soldiers tore the emblems from their standards and cast them into the flames. The smell of burning wood and incense filled the air. Mark Antony stood back, his face lit by the fire's glow. The rain hissed as it struck the blaze, sending clouds of steam into the air. "Peace, my countrymen," he murmured, though even he knew peace was gone. The mob turned, then not toward mourning, but vengeance. They stormed through the city, seeking the homes of the conspirators, tearing down their statues, setting fire to their estates. The capital shook with their fury, and in that chaos, Rome began to change. The republic that Brutus and Cassius claimed to save had already died, consumed not by one man's ambition, but by the wrath of those who loved him. By nightfall, the ashes of Caesar still glowed in the forum, a quiet ember beneath the rain. The streets were slick with mud and tears. Above it all, the moon broke through the clouds, pale and distant, shining upon the city that had murdered its own father. Mark Antony stood there long after the crowds had gone, staring at the smoke drifting toward the stars. "Sleep well, Caesar," he whispered. "Your Rome will never sleep again." In Daything and Quits, the fall of the Republic, the ashes of Julius Caesar had hardly cooled before Rome began to tear itself apart. The Forum, which had once echoed with the laughter of markets and the rhythm of speeches, now trembled with the footsteps of soldiers and the murmur of vengeance. The Republic, which the conspirators had claimed to save, stood hollow, and blood-stained its heart burned on Caesar's pyre. For a moment, the assassins believed they had succeeded. In the hours after the murder, they marched through the streets with daggers held high, shouting that Rome was free again. "Liberty!" cried Brutus and Cassius, their robes still spotted with the blood of the man they had called tyrant. But the word fell flat. No cheer rose from the people. No joy answered them. Rome's silence was its verdict. When night fell, they fled the city for the capital, surrounded by trembling senators and a handful of soldiers who followed out of fear rather than loyalty. Below, the torches of the mob flickered like stars scattered across the forum. The air was thick with smoke, grief, and the sour stench of betrayal. The next morning, they sent envoys to Mark Antony. They hoped he might forgive, that he might act as mediator. Antony agreed to meet them, but the man who entered the Senate that day was no longer merely Caesar's ally. He was a weapon sharpened by loss. The scene that followed was surreal. Antony, outwardly calm, proposed peace. He promised that no one would be punished, that Rome could heal if all laid down their anger. Brutus and Cassius, weary and desperate, agreed. They swore oaths beside Caesar's empty chair, their hands trembling. But as the ink dried, Antony was already preparing something else. The funeral had lit the fuse. Antony's speech had been the spark. Now Rome itself began to burn. Crowds filled the streets, shouting for vengeance. Veterans tore the daggers from Caesar's statues and raised them high. The conspirators' homes were attacked. Their families fled into the countryside. Brutus, Cassius, and their allies escaped to the east, gathering what legions they could. Antony, standing in Caesar's shadow, claimed to act in the name of peace, but peace was a language Rome no longer understood. Caesar's will had named a surprise heir, Gaius Octavius, his great-nephew, a quiet, slender youth, barely 18 years old. When Octavian arrived in Italy, no one expected much of him. He was polite, educated, frail from illness, a scholar, not a soldier. But behind those calm grey eyes burned something Caesar himself would have recognized. An intelligence like ice, and a patience that could wait out storms. At first, Antony dismissed him. A boy who owes his name to another's death, he sneered. But Octavian moved quickly. He paid the legions from Caesar's treasure, earning their loyalty. He spoke humbly in the forum, declaring his only wish was to avenge his uncle. The people, weary of chaos, began to cheer him. Rome now had two Caesars, one of muscle, one of mind. Their alliance was uneasy from the beginning. Antony sought power openly, while Octavian cloaked ambition in obedience. The Senate tried to pit them against each other, but the chaos that followed Caesar's death had weakened it beyond repair. Rome was no longer ruled by law, it was ruled by armies. By 43 B.C., the city had become a battlefield of whispers and blades. Antony, commanding veteran legions, marched north to confront the Senate's forces, led by Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's assassins. The battle was savage, a clash of Romans against Romans, of former allies turned mortal enemies. Antony's army was driven back, but not destroyed. In the confusion that followed, Octavian made his move. He entered Rome at the head of his own troops, demanded the consulship, and received it. The senators, too frightened to resist, gave it to him. The boy had become a ruler, and then, with chilling clarity, Octavian reached out to Antony. "Let us end this," he said. "The assassins still live. The Republic bleeds. Together, we can finish what my father began." The two men met on a small island in the river Reno. With them came another, Marcus Lepidus, a loyal lieutenant of Caesar's who commanded the remaining armies of Spain and Africa. There, the three clasped hands. The second triumvirate was born. It was not a partnership of friendship, but of necessity. Each man needed the others to survive. Antony had the veterans, Lepidus had the provinces, and Octavian had the name Caesar, the name that could move men's hearts and open Rome's coffers. Together, they swore to avenge the fallen leader and restore order to the Republic. But their order would come in blood. They began by drawing up a list. Names, hundreds of them, senators, knights, orators, magistrates, anyone who might oppose them or had shown sympathy to Brutus and Cassius. It was called the proscription, a word Rome had learned to fear since Sulla's days. Each dawn, the names were posted in the forum. Citizens awoke to find their neighbours declared enemies of the state. Some fled, others were dragged from their homes. Property was seized, families ruined. Heads of the condemned were displayed in the rostra, eyes glassy beneath the blazing sun. Among the names was one that chilled Rome to its core, Marcus Tullius Cicero. The great orator had once been Caesar's rival, then Antony's critic. His eloquence had stirred the Senate to defiance. His letters had called Antony a butcher. For this, Antony demanded his death. Cicero fled to the coast, hoping to sail for Greece, but the assassins found him near Formiae. When he saw them approach, he did not run. He bared his neck and said calmly, "There is nothing proper about what you do, soldiers, but try to kill me properly." His head and hands were brought to Rome and nailed to the rostra, the same platform from which he had once defended liberty. When Antony saw them, he laughed. When Octavian saw them, he said nothing. But those who knew him well noticed that his silence lasted a long time. While the streets of Rome ran with blood, Brutus and Cassius had gathered their armies in the east, over 80,000 men. They wrote letters proclaiming the return of freedom, but their armies fought not for liberty, only for revenge. In 42 B.C., the two forces met on the plains of Philippi in Macedonia. It was a clash of worlds, the last breath of the Republic against the first heartbeat of empire. The field was wide and golden, the air heavy with heat. In their camp, Brutus and Cassius prayed to the old gods. In the other, Antony and Octavian addressed their soldiers in Caesar's name. "Show them," Antony cried, "that the blood of Caesar has not gone cold." The battle lasted 2 days. On the first, Cassius was misled into believing his forces were destroyed. He retreated to a nearby hill and, blinded by despair, ordered his servant to kill him. When Brutus found his body, he wept, but there was no time for mourning. The next morning, he led the final charge. The fight was brutal, hand to hand, shield against shield, but the legions of Caesar did not falter. As dusk fell, Brutus was surrounded. He turned his sword upon himself, whispering, "Caesar, now be still. I slew not you with half so good a will." When Antony found his body, he covered it with his cloak and wept. "This was the noblest Roman of them all," he said. The Republic had died with him. The victors divided the world among themselves. Antony took the east, Lepidus the west, and Octavian the heart of Rome. But even as they swore friendship, each plotted the other's fall. Antony sailed to Egypt, where a queen awaited him, Cleopatra, the same who had once shared Caesar's bed. Octavian, watching from Rome, saw in their union not love but threat. The story was beginning again, written in a different hand. Rome had avenged its Caesar, but it had lost its soul. The Senate was a shadow, the law a weapon, the people exhausted. Out of chaos, only one power would remain. And somewhere, beneath the ruins of the old Republic, the echo of a voice seemed to linger. "You too, Brutus." The world that Caesar had built with words and war would now remake itself in his image. Sharper, colder, eternal. The Republic was gone. The Empire was stirring. The dawn of the Empire. Rome stood changed. The Republic that had lived for nearly 5 centuries was gone, not with ceremony or applause, but with a long, exhausted sigh. Its marble temples still gleamed. Its Senate still met. Its people still shouted in the forum, but something invisible had shifted. The spirit of freedom that once burned in every Roman chest had been replaced by something quieter, heavier, inevitable. Obedience. From the ashes of Caesar's pyre, 3 men had risen to divide the world. But it was not meant to be shared. Power, like Rome's sun, could have only one sky. Mark Antony, now ruler of the East, governed from Alexandria. His life had become a haze of gold and music, of feasts on Nile barges, and the laughter of a queen who had already captured one Caesar's heart. Cleopatra, proud and radiant, sat beside him as partner and goddess. Together they lived as monarchs, not magistrates, and the world, for a brief time, seemed theirs. In the West, Marcus Lepidus faded into irrelevance, his authority consumed by indecision. Rome was left between 2 giants, Antony, the warrior of passion, and Octavian, the youth of cold reason. Octavian ruled from Rome, patient as winter. He dressed modestly, spoke softly, and smiled rarely. But behind those calm eyes, he calculated everything. He paid the soldiers well, distributed Caesar's wealth wisely, and built his image not as a tyrant, but as the restorer of order. The Senate, weary of chaos, began to bow to him willingly. He did not need to seize power. Rome handed it to him. Still, Antony's name haunted the capital. His fame, his charisma, his legend, they lingered like the echo of a song. The people still loved him. The veterans still toasted him. To many, Antony was the true heir of Caesar's fire, while Octavian was but the shadow that followed it. Octavian understood the danger. And so, as Caesar had done before him, he turned war, into theatre. He began quietly, whispering doubts into the ears of senators. Antony, he said, had forgotten he was Roman. He no longer served the Republic, he served a queen. He had given himself to the East, to luxury, to Egypt, to a woman who called herself goddess and dared to speak to Rome as an equal. It was not a lie, but it was not the whole truth. Antony had indeed become intoxicated by the East, by the temples, the incense, the golden light of Alexandria. Cleopatra understood him as no Roman ever had. She saw in him not a general, but a myth, a man born to rule, not to serve. She surrounded him with poets, philosophers, and priests who called him Dionysus, reborn. Together they staged parades of wonder. Antony in silver armor, Cleopatra as Isis, their children dressed as pharaohs. The world watched in awe. Rome watched in horror. When news reached the Senate that Antony had granted lands to Cleopatra's children, gifts of Roman territory, Octavian seized the moment. Standing before the senators, he held up a copy of Antony's will, stolen from the Vestal Virgin's temple, and read aloud the lines that sealed Antony's fate. I, Marcus Antonius, desire to be buried beside Queen Cleopatra in Alexandria. 10. The chamber erupted in outrage. Gasps, curses, fists pounding the marble benches. A Roman general, they cried, would rather rest with a foreign queen than in his own land. The message was clear. Antony had become a traitor. Cleopatra, a sorceress. The East, a threat. And so, Octavian declared war not on Antony, but on Egypt. The war that followed was less a clash of armies than of worlds. Antony and Cleopatra gathered their fleets in the Ionian Sea. Hundreds of ships, gilded and massive, their sails purple and gold. Octavian, with his admiral Agrippa, met them with Rome's finest legions and the discipline of machine-like precision. The two forces faced one another near the western coast of Greece, at Actium, in the late summer of 31 B.C. The sun beat down upon the water, dazzling and merciless. From dawn to dusk, the fleets circled, the air filled with the crash of rams and the screams of men drowning in armor. Cleopatra's flagship gleamed at the center, its deck draped in silks, its masts crowned with silver. But war is not won by splendor. Octavian's ships were smaller, faster, and his commanders merciless. One by one, Antony's galleys caught fire or sank beneath the waves. Smoke choked the air, turning the sea into a mirror of ash. Then, as the battle raged, Cleopatra's flagship suddenly turned her sails, catching the wind as she fled south toward Egypt. Antony, seeing her departure, made the fateful choice that would seal both their fates. He broke formation and followed her. His men saw him go and despaired. The line broke, the sea burned. By nightfall, the battle was lost. Octavian pursued them relentlessly. He entered Egypt a year later, not as conqueror but as executioner. Antony, broken and disgraced, wandered the palace of Alexandria like a ghost. Cleopatra still tried to bargain, to weave alliances from the threads of her beauty and brilliance. But she knew the game was over. When Octavian's soldiers stormed the gates, Antony took his own life upon his sword, dying in Cleopatra's arms. His last words were for her that she had been his fortune, his ruin, and his crown. Cleopatra followed him soon after. Legend says she lay upon her golden bed, dressed in royal finery, and pressed a small venomous asp to her breast. When Octavian entered her chambers, he found her lifeless, serene, still radiant in death. The queen who had held two Caesars in her grasp was gone. With her death, the last breath of the old world vanished. Egypt became a Roman province. Its treasures flowed into Rome's coffers. Antony's children were taken captive, their mother's throne now a relic. Octavian returned to Rome in triumph. The Senate hailed him as Augustus, meaning the Exalted One. They named him Princeps, the first citizen of Rome, and swore allegiance to his vision of peace, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. He did not call himself emperor, He did not need to. His word was law, his image divine. The Republic lived in name only, embalmed like a corpse in the rituals of old government. The Empire was born in silence, not with revolution, but with applause. And so began a new age. Marble replaced brick, order replaced chaos, and Caesar's legacy, his dream of unity, of greatness, of eternal Rome, was at last realized, though not by his own hand. On the anniversary of his great-uncle's death, Augustus stood before Caesar's statue in the Forum, the air heavy with incense and memory. He looked up at the face carved in stone, calm, commanding, immortal, and whispered, "I have done what you began." A gust of wind swept through the Forum, carrying dust across the steps. To those who watched, it seemed as if the statue's shadow lengthened, stretching across the marble toward the young ruler's feet. Rome had lost her father, but gained her God, the legacy eternal. The sun rose over Rome with a light older than empires. It glowed on the marble of temples and the gold of the Capitoline roofs, spilling down the 7 hills like a blessing, or perhaps a reminder. For though time had carried away the shouts of the Forum and the clang of swords, one name still lingered in the air like the echo of a god's breath. Caesar. He was gone, yet everywhere. His face, carved in marble, watched from every corner of the city. His name was spoken in every ceremony, stamped on every coin, murmured in every oath of allegiance. Children born long after his death played games pretending to be him. Poets sang of him as the man who had bridged the mortal and the divine. Even the Senate, that old, jealous body that had once trembled before him, bowed now before his memory. The temple of Gaius Julius stood in the Forum where his body had burned. A column of white marble rose from the ashes, crowned with a golden star, a symbol of the comet that had blazed across the sky during the games held in his honor. The people had pointed to it and cried, "Behold, Caesar's soul ascends to heaven." And thus the Senate, eager to follow the will of the crowd, declared him a god. So it was that Julius Caesar, who had once refused a king's crown, now wore one far higher. In the years that followed, Augustus, his heir, built a world shaped in his image. He called it peace, but it was the peace of discipline, the peace of Caesar made eternal. The legions patrolled the frontiers from the sands of Africa to the forests of Germania. Roads spread like veins through the heart of the empire, each stone whispering the same truth, that Caesar's dream had survived him. Rome became a mirror of his will, grand, ordered, magnificent. The marble he once promised replaced brick. The chaos he once fought became harmony under a single rule. Even time itself now bore his mark. The calendar he had forged in his restless intellect counted the days, the months, the years. Every man in every province lived within his rhythm. It was said that Caesar's hand reached further in death than any emperor's in life. Yet beneath the order, the memory of his blood never faded. Old men who had once seen him pass through the Forum still spoke in low voices of the day he fell. They could not forget the sight of his body, broken at the feet of Pompey's statue, or the silence that followed. They told their grandchildren that Rome had killed her greatest son, and in doing so, had made him immortal. Even those who hated him could not escape him. Brutus and Cassius had perished by their own swords, but their names survived only as shadows beside his flame. Cicero's words, once thunderous, now seemed faint beside the sentences Caesar had written with his armies. Pompey, his rival, lay forgotten beneath Egyptian sands. Caesar alone endured. He had dreamed of an empire, united under one rule, and though he had not lived to see it, his vision had triumphed. The Republic had been too small for him. The empire fit him perfectly. It was not ruled by debate or tradition, but by will, the will he had taught his heirs to wield like a blade. Augustus called himself princeps, first among equals, but the people knew better. He was Caesar, reborn, the flesh of the same destiny, the mind of the same design. Every ruler after him would take that name, not as a title but as a crown. Caesar became more than a man. It became a word for power itself. Centuries later, when new empires rose from the ruins of the old in Germany, in Russia, in lands Caesar never knew their rulers would still reach for his shadow, Kaiser, Tsar. The echo of his name rippled through the ages, reshaped by tongues that never spoke Latin, bound by the same awe. And always, his story remained. Historians wrote of him with trembling pens, poets with burning ones. Some called him savior, others tyrant. Some praised his mercy, others cursed his ambition. But all agreed on one thing: he had changed the nature of power. Before Caesar, men ruled by law. After Caesar, they ruled by presence, by the strength of their gaze, the gravity of their voice, the weight of their legend. His genius had not been war alone, nor politics, nor rhetoric, but the rare alchemy of all three. He could charm a crowd as easily as command an army, forgive an enemy as easily as destroy him. He understood that men did not live by bread alone, they lived by stories, by the myths they built around greatness. And so, even as his body died, his story had already begun to live forever. There is something almost quiet about that kind of immortality. It does not roar. It whispers. It does not burn. It glows. It is not carved into stone. It seeps into time. 2 generations after his death, travellers would come to the Forum at dusk and see the flame still burning in front of his temple, tended day and night by priests of the Divus Julius. They would pause, remove their sandals, and listen to the hum of the city, the distant roll of carts, the laughter of children in the streets, and for a moment they would think of the man whose footsteps had once echoed through those same stones, the man who had crossed rivers no Roman dared to cross, who had turned enemies into nations, who had fallen beneath 23 wounds and risen beyond the reach of death. They would look up at the star above the temple, the same star that had appeared on the day of his funeral games, and they would whisper, Caesar, no longer a man, no longer a name, a force. Time would move on. Empires would crumble. Barbarians would march through Rome's gates. The marble of the Forum would crack and fade. Yet even then, even in the silence of ruins, the story would survive. The wind itself would carry it. For in every age, there are men who build, men who destroy, and a rare few who become the bridge between both. Julius Caesar had been one of those few, the storm that broke the old world and gave birth to the new. And though his life ended in blood and betrayal, his vision endured. That Rome could be eternal, that power could be art, that destiny could be shaped by human hands. The Republic had died, but in its ashes, the empire rose not as its denial, but as its fulfillment. And somewhere, in the quiet between centuries, one might almost hear his voice, soft as a whisper, carried by time. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. But what he conquered most was not Gaul, nor Egypt, nor the Senate's fear. It was time itself. The night settles again over Rome. The stars shine above the ruins of the Forum, and among them burns one brighter than the rest, the Julian star. The same that blazed the night Caesar became divine. Its light falls on marble and grass, on temples broken and roads still standing, and in that silver glow, history breathes. Julius Caesar sleeps, but his dream does not, and if one listens long enough, through the hush of centuries, the faint rhythm of marching feet can still be heard, the sound of Rome itself, echoing forever. And now, as the story closes, imagine the city quieting once more. The torches dim, the marble glows pale in the moonlight, the distant Tiber murmurs, as it has for thousands of years, carrying whispers of emperors and echoes of lost glory. You can almost see him there, not the god in marble, not the conqueror in armor, but the man, standing alone in a white toga, hands clasped behind his back, gazing toward the horizon where the empire's heart once beat. His life was a tempest ambition, war, betrayal, triumph, and yet it ended, as all things do, in silence. Still, the world he forged endures. The roads he ordered are still walked. The calendar he shaped still marks our days. The words he spoke of courage, of destiny, of greatness, still breathe through history. Rome fell, empires rose and died. But the idea of Caesar, the dream of what one human will can shape from chaos, never faded. It flickers still in the hearts of every generation that looks upon ruins and imagines what could be built anew. So tonight, as you close your eyes, let that thought linger, that even from the ashes of failure, greatness can rise again. That even one life, when lived without fear, can outlast time. The marble cracks, the stars shift, but the dream endures. Rest now, beneath the same sky that watched him rise and fall.